Hello friend, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we go anywhere tonight, if these stories have been keeping you company, a like helps more than you would probably guess. And if you want more nights like this one waiting for you whenever you need them, subscribing costs nothing and means a great deal to me. That is the whole pitch. I promise I will not bring it up again tonight. What I would genuinely love to know is where you are listening from right now. Maybe you're tucked into a quiet bedroom somewhere in Phoenix, Arizona, with the air conditioner humming steadily behind the wall. Maybe you're curled up on a porch in a small Ohio town, a box fan turning slowly in the corner, just enough to stir the warm night air around you. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, always. All right, love, let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest. Let's go. Tonight we're stepping into the Gilded Age, that strange, glittering stretch of American history running roughly from the 1870s to the very first years of the 1900s, and we're going to look at the things wealthy people did back then and considered completely, unremarkably normal. Feeding their dogs at the dining table with a footman standing behind each chair, wearing brooches woven from a dead relative's hair, hiring an entire household of people whose single job was to make sure the family never once had to see them working. Things that would stop a modern dinner party cold. We are not opening in a ballroom tonight. Almost every story about this era opens in a ballroom. Chandeliers blazing overhead, an orchestra tuning up somewhere behind a curtain, gowns that cost more than a small house sweeping across polished marble. And if you have watched even one film set in this world, you already know that version of it by heart, down to the very last detail. So let us skip it completely. We're going to start somewhere smaller instead. A drawing room on the corner of Fifth Avenue, and a street in the 50s on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in the autumn of 1882 at 3:15, which is, and I promise you, this detail matters more than it sounds like it should, the single most socially loaded quarter hour of the entire week. Maybe she is 34, with a kind of composure that took her the better part of a decade to build, and that she can still, on certain afternoons, feel slipping through her fingers like water she's not quite able to hold on to. Maybe she's the wife of a man whose name appears in the financial columns with the word banker attached to it, a word that sounds solid, and this particular autumn is not quite as solid as it sounds. Maybe she's sitting very still in a small parlour just off the main hall, fully dressed, hair done, jewellery chosen with more calculation than she would like to admit, waiting for the clock to reach 3:15. And there is a particular carefulness in the way she's been going over the household accounts this week. The same 3 columns of figures moved and rearranged, and quietly closed again. A carefulness that has nothing to do with fashion, and everything to do with arithmetic. Her husband has been strange for 11 days now, short in his letters, vague about a shipment of railroad bonds that has not settled the way it was supposed to, and she has told no one what she suspects. Not her sister, who would not be able to hold the worry past breakfast. Not her own mother, not even, fully, herself. Not yet. Not until she has worked out what it might mean for the dinner she's meant to host in the spring, for the rest of this season, for the particular kind of scrutiny a woman of her position receives the moment anyone senses she might be struggling. Because to be seen struggling, even faintly, even for a single week, invites a very specific kind of arithmetic from other women. Women who know how to count a husband's silences and a household's cancelled orders with the quiet efficiency of accountants. That is not the story anyone tells about the Gilded Age. She knows this particular hour by heart. She has been raised inside it, the same way her own mother was raised inside it before her, and the same way, whether she ever chooses it or not, it will go on quietly shaping the women who come after her. Here is the strange part. The part that would confuse a modern person completely. On Thursday afternoons, a certain class of New York woman sat in her own home, in her own front parlour, and waited to be visited by other women she often did not particularly like, for exactly 15 minutes at a time, in a ritual so rigid it had its own written rules, and during almost none of those 15 minutes did any real conversation happen at all. It was not a visit in the way we would mean the word today. It was a performance of visiting, a piece of social bookkeeping conducted in person, and it decided with more finality than almost anything else in her life who she was. The calling card itself was a small rectangle of heavy stock, engraved, never printed, because printed cards marked you instantly as someone trying too hard, and the rules around it were dense enough that entire etiquette manuals devoted 40 or 50 pages to card behaviour alone. A woman's card had her name only, no title beyond Mrs. A man's card, smaller, carried his name and sometimes his club. When you called on someone and they were not home, or pretended not to be home, which happened constantly and which everyone understood and nobody acknowledged, you left your card with the servant at the door, and the exact way you folded the corner of that card said something specific. A corner turned down on the left meant you had called in person rather than sending the card by messenger. A corner folded across the top could mean congratulations or condolences, or a farewell before travel, depending on which corner and which occasion, and getting it wrong, folding the wrong corner for the wrong reason, was the kind of small social error that could follow a woman for a season. And here is the detail that I think genuinely stops people cold once they understand it. Being home and receiving a caller, and being home and not receiving a caller, were two entirely different social facts, and the household staff were trained explicitly to lie about which one was happening. Not lie in the sense of doing something scandalous. Lie in the sense that everyone had agreed as a society to treat as true. If the mistress of the house did not wish to see a particular visitor, the butler or the parlour maid would simply say she was not at home, even while she sat 12 feet away in the next room, perfectly visible through the doorway if you knew where to look, perfectly audible if the visitor listened for the creak of a floorboard. The phrase "not at home" did not mean absent, it meant unavailable, and everyone involved understood the difference and preserved the fiction anyway, because the fiction was the entire point. It let a woman decline a visit without the confrontation of declining it. It let a friendship end quietly instead of loudly. It let the whole machinery of status sorting itself out behind a screen of perfect, practiced politeness. I find myself genuinely admiring the design of it, honestly, even though I also find it a little exhausting to imagine living inside. A whole language built entirely out of small physical objects and their careful mishandling, understood by everyone in the room and spoken by almost nobody out loud. Now, the woman we're following this afternoon, let us say her name is Adelaide, though of course that is not really anyone. That is simply a shape for you to pour yourself into if you want to. Adelaide has been sitting in her front parlour since 2:30, and she has already received 2 callers today, both brief, both nearly identical in structure. A woman arrives, is announced by the servant, enters, and the two of them exchange perhaps 6 minutes of conversation about nothing at all. The weather, a concert at the Academy of Music, someone's health, discussed in the vaguest possible terms. Then the visitor rises, and this is the part that always struck me as almost theatrical in its precision, because rising to leave was itself a signal, and a hostess who tried to prolong a visit past its natural 15 minutes was making a small social overreach that the more experienced women in the room would quietly note. Adelaide's third caller of the afternoon is a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who Adelaide does not especially like, and who does not especially like Adelaide, and both of them know this, and neither of them will ever say it, not once, not in 100 years of Thursday afternoons. Mrs. Pruitt sits on the edge of the small gilt chair reserved for callers, keeps her gloves on, which is itself a rule. Removing gloves during a call signalled an intimacy the visit had not earned, and speaks about the weather for 90 seconds before pivoting, with the kind of skill that takes years to develop, into a question about whether Adelaide's daughter will be presented this coming season. This is not idle curiosity. This is reconnaissance, whether a family's daughter will be presented, and when, and under whose sponsorship tells you an enormous amount about that family's rising or falling position. And Mrs. Pruitt has come today specifically to find out, wrapped inside 6 minutes of talk about a concert neither of them attended, Adelaide answers carefully. Gives away exactly as much as she wants given away and not one word more. This is a skill, and it took her years to build it, this ability to sit across from someone smiling and holding a teacup, and give a completely truthful answer that reveals almost nothing. She learned it from her own mother, who learned it from hers, and somewhere in that inheritance is a kind of quiet, specific intelligence that history has mostly declined to notice because it does not look like intelligence from the outside. It looks like small talk. It is not small talk. It is strategy conducted at conversational volume. There was a darker cousin to the polite fiction of Not at Home, and it was called the cut direct. And it was, without exaggeration, one of the most socially devastating things one person could do to another in this world. More devastating in its way than an actual argument, because an argument at least acknowledged the other person existed. The cut direct meant looking directly at someone you knew, in public, on the street, or at the opera, or across a crowded room, and simply not seeing them. No nod, no flicker of recognition, eyes moving past the person's face as though it were a lamppost. It was usually delivered by a woman of higher standing to a woman she'd decided, for reasons that might range from genuine scandal to something as small as a rumour never confirmed, no longer existed within her social world, and the person who received a cut direct in public had almost no way to respond to it, because responding, saying something, reacting visibly, only confirmed that the cut had landed, that it had hurt, that you had noticed. The correct response, the only socially survivable response, was to pretend you hadn't noticed either, to keep walking, keep smiling, keep your face perfectly composed, while inside, as more than one diary from the period records, something like a small private earthquake was happening. I want to be honest with you about something. I find this detail genuinely upsetting, in a way some of the more famous Gilded Age excesses are not. The gold and the diamonds are almost funny at this distance. The cut direct is not funny, it is just cruelty, dressed very carefully, delivered with a straight spine and a perfectly blank face. At the very top of this entire structure, presiding over who received calls and who received cuts, who was invited and who was quietly, permanently, never invited again, sat a woman named Caroline Astor, though almost nobody who mattered called her that. She was simply Mrs. Astor, said with a particular weight, the way you might say a title rather than a name. And Mrs. Astor's ballroom in her Fifth Avenue mansion happened to hold exactly 400 people comfortably. This is not a metaphor. This is an actual architectural fact about an actual room, and it produced one of the strangest and most consequential numbers in American social history, because Mrs. Astor's ballroom capacity effectively became the ceiling for who counted as society in New York at all. If you were not among the roughly 400 names on the list, her advisor, a man named Ward McAllister, helped compile, you were not, in the eyes of this world, truly anyone, regardless of how much money you had. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because money, it turned out, was almost beside the point. New York in these decades was full of families with staggering new fortunes, built in railroads and oil and steel and mining, families with more actual cash than the old Knickerbocker families, whose ancestors had been quietly wealthy since the Dutch colonial period. And those old families, the ones Mrs. Astor represented, looked at the new money with something close to horror. Not because it was smaller, because it was new. There was, in this world, a difference understood by everyone and spoken aloud by almost no one, between money that had been in a family long enough to have forgotten it was ever earned, and money that still smelled, faintly, of the factory or the mine it came from. The Vanderbilts learned this lesson the hard way, and it is one of my favourite stories from the entire period, because it shows you, better than almost anything else, how these rules actually worked in practice. William Henry Vanderbilt's family had, by the 1880s, more money than almost anyone alive in America, vastly more than the Astors, and yet for years Mrs. Astor would not receive them, would not call on them, would not invite them, because in her calculation the Vanderbilt fortune was still one generation too fresh, still smelled of the railroad rather than the drawing room. It took a woman named Alva Vanderbilt, married into the family and possessed of a will that several biographers have described using words considerably less polite than determined, to break through. She built a chateau on Fifth Avenue that made Mrs. Astor's house look almost modest by comparison. And then she planned a costume ball so extravagant, so widely covered in the newspapers, that not being invited became for the first time a worse social wound than not being received by the Astors ever had been. Mrs. Astor's own daughter wanted desperately to attend. Mrs. Astor, faced with the choice between her daughter's happiness and 40 years of careful social gatekeeping, folded. She called on Alva Vanderbilt. The card was left, the invitation arrived. And with that single visit, the entire hierarchy of the city quietly, permanently shifted. I love this story because it tells you something true about the whole system underneath all the etiquette and the folded card corners. It looked, from the outside, like an ancient, unbreakable code of birth and breeding. It was actually much closer to a negotiation, conducted very slowly, in a language designed to look like it wasn't a negotiation at all. That costume ball is worth sitting inside for a moment, because the details of it are the kind of thing that sound invented, even though every one of them is documented. It was held in March of 1883, and it cost, by some estimates, something in the range of what an average labourer would have needed several lifetimes to earn. Alva Vanderbilt appeared as a Venetian princess in a gown embroidered with real gold and silver thread that had taken a Parisian workshop months to complete. Her sister-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, came dressed as electric light itself, an actual battery sewn into her costume so that a torch in her upraised hand genuinely glowed, which was, in 1883, a piece of theatre most of the guests had never seen anything like, electricity still being new enough in private homes that its mere presence was a kind of spectacle. There were quadrilles rehearsed for weeks in advance, groups of guests performing choreographed dances in matching costume themes, a hobby horse quadrille where dancers wore elaborate fake horses strapped around their waists, a Dresden China quadrille where the dancers dressed as porcelain figurines come to life. And here is the detail I keep coming back to. The ball did not start until well after 11 at night, and did not properly end until after the sun had come up, because that was simply how these evenings were built. Late arrival, dancing until dawn, breakfast served as the sky was already turning grey outside the windows. An entire class of people who had, structurally, nowhere they needed to be in the morning, living on a clock that had almost nothing to do with daylight at all. I want to step away from the ballrooms for a moment now, and bring you somewhere smaller and, honestly, somewhere a little stranger. Let us go into a dressing room. Maybe you are a young woman now, 22 or 23, unmarried, from a family with money but not quite enough of the right kind of history to guarantee her a place at the top of the pile. And you are sitting at your dressing table on an evening in the mid-1880s, preparing for a dinner, and on the table in front of you, among the hairpins and the powder, sits a small tin of wafers that a chemist sold you, quite legally, with a label promising a clear and luminous complexion. Those wafers contain arsenic. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. Arsenic complexion wafers were a real, widely sold, entirely legal beauty product through much of this period, marketed specifically on the premise that a small regular dose of arsenic would give the skin a particular pale, almost translucent quality that the era considered the height of beauty, the opposite of a working woman's sun-browned complexion, a visible signal that you had never once needed to labor outdoors. Women took them as a kind of maintenance, the way someone today might take a daily vitamin, without any real understanding, or without wanting to understand, of what the substance was doing to their bodies in the process. Some of the effects were the ones the advertisers promised, a certain waxen paleness. Others were the ones nobody printed on the tin, digestive damage, hair thinning, in some documented cases far worse. And arsenic was not alone on that dressing table. Belladonna drops, made from a plant whose name literally means beautiful woman in Italian, were used to dilate the pupils, because large, dark, glassy pupils were considered enormously attractive, a look we would probably now associate more with illness than allure. The active compound in belladonna is a genuine poison, and the drops caused blurred vision, sometimes so severely that a woman wearing them could barely make out a face across the room, and yet she wore them anyway. An entire evening spent charming a room through a haze of chemically induced near-blindness, because the effect in the mirror beforehand had been worth it. There is something in that I find worth sitting with for a second, not to condemn it exactly, because every era does some version of this, but because it tells you how completely the definition of beauty in this world had detached itself from anything resembling health, and had attached itself instead, almost entirely, to signals of leisure. Pale skin meant you did not work outside. Dilated eyes and a certain languid slowness of movement meant you were not rushing anywhere, because rushing was for people whose time belonged to someone else. The most desirable body in this narrow slice of American history was a body that visibly, unmistakably, did not have to do anything at all. Now about the corset, because I think this is one of those subjects everybody has half heard something about and almost nobody has heard the full, strange truth of. Tight lacing, the practice of cinching a corset tight enough to dramatically reduce the waist, sometimes down toward what magazines of the era breathlessly reported as 16 or 17 inches, though most historians now believe those extreme numbers were more often advertising fantasy than daily reality for most women. Still, even a moderately fashionable lacing, nothing close to those extremes, restricted the rib cage and the lungs in ways that produced a genuine, physical, medically documented consequence, and that consequence was fainting. Fainting was common enough among fashionable women that households, and even public venues like theatres and churches, kept smelling salts on hand almost as a matter of course, the way you might keep a first aid kit today. A small vial of ammonia salts, sharp enough to startle the senses back awake, sat in reticules and on mantelpieces and in the pockets of attentive husbands, because a wife or daughter growing pale and unsteady mid-conversation was simply an occasional, expected event, not an emergency exactly, more like a mild inconvenience the whole room knew how to handle. There is something almost tender in that, if you look at it a certain way, an entire social world quietly organized around the routine possibility that its women might at any moment simply run out of air. And yet, here is the detail that always surprises people. Fainting was not purely a medical inconvenience. It was also, on occasion, a genuinely useful social tool, and everyone half knew it even while nobody said so out loud. A well-timed feint could end an uncomfortable conversation instantly, could remove a woman from a proposal she did not want to answer directly, could interrupt an argument before it went somewhere unrecoverable. Several etiquette writers of the period wrote, with a straight face, about the correct way to catch a fainting lady, which arm to place where, how to loosen a collar without disturbing a hairstyle that had taken 90 minutes to build. The performance of collapse had its own choreography, learned the same way the 15-minute call had its own choreography, and I find that, honestly, a little bit brilliant, in the way that people trapped inside rigid systems so often find clever, quiet ways to bend them without ever technically breaking a single rule. There is somewhere darker I want to take you for a moment, because mourning in this era deserves real attention, and it will not take long before you understand why. When a person of means died, their widow entered what the etiquette manuals called deep mourning, and the rules governing it were staggering in their specificity. For a widow, deep mourning traditionally lasted a full year and a day, during which she wore only black, and not just any black, a particular dull, non-reflective black crepe fabric that etiquette writers insisted upon, because anything with a sheen to it was considered inappropriately cheerful. No jewellery except mourning jewellery, which we will come to in a moment. No social calls paid, though calls could be received briefly by a small circle. No theatre, no concerts, no parties of any kind. After the first year, she moved into what was called second mourning, where small amounts of grey or lavender, or a muted purple called mauve, were permitted to creep back into the wardrobe, a slow, carefully staged return to colour that could stretch on for another year or more, depending on the closeness of the relationship and the family's own sense of propriety. Children in mourning for a parent, parents in mourning for a child, all had their own prescribed durations, shorter than a widow's but still substantial, and an entire retail industry grew up specifically to supply this demand. Whole department stores in London and New York devoted floors entirely to mourning goods, from the crepe itself down to black-bordered stationery for condolence letters and black-edged handkerchiefs. And then there was the jewellery, and this is the detail that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it clearly explained. Mourning jewellery was very often made, in part or entirely, from the hair of the deceased. A lock of hair, carefully cut, was sent to a specialist jeweller or jet worker who would weave it, braid it, sometimes almost sculpt it, into intricate patterns, coiled into a brooch, worked into a bracelet clasp, sealed under glass in a locket alongside a small oval photograph. This was not considered morbid in the way it would strike most of us today. It was considered tender, an act of literal physical closeness to someone who was gone, a way of keeping a small part of the actual person against your skin. Some of these pieces survive in museum collections now, extraordinary examples of a craft that has essentially vanished. Tight woven patterns of human hair formed into flowers, into anchors, into willow trees weeping over a small enameled tomb. Speaking of things kept close against the skin, or in this case poured directly into the body, I want to talk for a moment about the medicine cabinet of this era, because it is, without exaggeration, one of the strangest rooms in the entire Gilded Age house, stranger even than the dressing table with its arsenic wafers. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, sat in most well-stocked households as an entirely ordinary remedy, sold without prescription at any pharmacy, used for headaches, for menstrual pain, for what the era vaguely and constantly called nerves, and I want to say this plainly because I think it deserves to be said plainly, it was regularly given to infants and small children to quiet them. Products sold under names like soothing syrups, marketed directly at exhausted mothers and the nursemaids employed to manage children through the night, contained morphine or opium in doses that would horrify any parent today, and were advertised, without irony, as gentle and harmless, safe enough for the smallest baby, a wealthy household's nursery. The room you might picture as the softest, safest space in the entire house quite often had a small brown bottle sitting on a high shelf that we would now recognize instantly as a serious and dangerous narcotic, used casually, used routinely, used because a quiet baby made for a quiet, well-ordered household, and a well-ordered household was, in this world, close to a moral good in itself. Cocaine, too, appeared in tonics and lozenges marketed for fatigue and for what was diagnosed endlessly as female nervous complaints, sold openly in drugstores well into the final years of the century. And here I want to slow down for a second and talk about that diagnosis itself, nervous complaints, or its more famous cousin, hysteria, because it shaped the medical experience of wealthy women in this period more than almost anything else we have talked about so far. Hysteria, as a diagnosis, was applied to an enormous, almost comically broad range of behavior. Anxiety, irritability, fatigue, a woman expressing frustration with her circumstances, a woman who read too much, according to some physicians of the period, quite literally too much, her nerves overtaxed by novels, a woman who did not want to have more children, a woman who simply seemed, to the men around her, somehow dissatisfied. The treatment most famously associated with severe cases was something called the rest cure, developed by a physician named Silas Weir Mitchell, and it involved at its most extreme weeks of near-total isolation. The patient was confined to bed, forbidden to read, forbidden to write, forbidden often even to sit up unassisted, fed a rich, fattening diet, and denied almost all intellectual or social stimulation on the theory that overactive nerves needed nothing so much as complete and prolonged rest. You may already know where this thread leads, because one particular patient of this treatment, a writer named Charlotte Perkins Gilman, turned her own experience of it into a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, about a woman confined to a single room by a well-meaning husband and doctor, slowly losing her mind against the pattern of the wallpaper because she has been given, quite literally, nothing else to think about. I mention this because it is one of the rare moments where we actually have, in a woman's own words, exactly what this specific piece of Gilded Age normal felt like from the inside, and it is not a comfortable read. It was not meant to be. The mood can lighten again for a moment, because not everything in this world was quite so dark. Some of it was simply delightfully absurd, and I think you have earned a little absurdity by now. Consider the dinner party, because the Gilded Age dinner party at its most extreme was less a meal than a kind of theatre, and some of the productions staged around it defy easy belief even with documentation sitting right in front of you. There is a dinner recorded in the New York press, hosted for a small group of guests, at which cigarettes were rolled not in ordinary paper, but in genuine $100 bills, handed around after the meal to be smoked, an act of casual destruction meant purely to demonstrate that the money existed in such quantity it could be set on fire for entertainment. There is another dinner, one of the more famous ones, held at Sherry's, one of the city's grand restaurants, in which the guests dined on horseback. Actual live horses led into the dining room. The animals fed from silver troughs while their riders ate a formal multi-course meal from small tables strapped somehow to the saddles, a piece of spectacle so strange that even contemporary newspapers, which had by this point seen a great deal, covered it with a kind of stunned fascination. And then there is the story, told and retold with slight variations depending on the source, of a dinner at which each guest found, folded discreetly into their napkin, a small pearl, a party favour worth more than most working families would see in a year, presented as casually as a chocolate mint might be presented today. Which brings us naturally to the animals, because Gilded Age New York had a genuinely strange relationship with pets, one that had almost nothing to do with companionship in the way we would understand the word today, and almost everything to do with display. There is a dinner held at Newport in the summer of 1897, hosted by a woman named Elizabeth Kernochan, at which the guests of honour were not people at all, they were dogs. A small number of society women were invited to bring their pets, and the dogs were seated at the table in high chairs, dressed for the occasion, some accounts say in tiny frilled collars and jewelled harnesses, and served a specially prepared menu that included, among other things, stewed liver and rice, fricassee of bones, and a shredded dog biscuit dessert with a bit of jelly. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, some with amusement, plenty with open outrage at a moment when the country was still recovering from a serious economic depression, and plenty of children in the same city had gone hungry that same week. The event became, almost instantly, a kind of shorthand people used for years afterward whenever they wanted to gesture at the sheer, careless excess of Newport's summer society. The dog dinner, said with an eyebrow raised, and everybody in the room understood exactly what you meant. Monkeys, too, had a strange little vogue as pets among the very wealthy, kept on leashes, dressed in small coats, occasionally, according to a handful of gossip columns, trained to perform small tricks for guests, a living novelty meant to signal a household exotic enough, wealthy enough, idle enough to keep an animal that served no purpose whatsoever beyond being unusual. Parrots, too, imported at considerable expense, kept in ornate cages in front hallways, sometimes taught a phrase or two specifically to startle visitors on their way in the door. None of this, I should say, reads to me as cruelty exactly, not in the way the era understood it. It reads as something closer to a kind of profound, restless boredom, an entire class of people with so much material comfort and so little to actually do with their days, that novelty itself became a form of currency, traded and displayed the same way jewellery was traded and displayed. We can leave the city now, because in the summer, that is exactly what this world did, almost in its entirety, migrating north to a town on the Rhode Island coast called Newport, where the wealthiest families of New York built what they insisted, with a straight face, on calling cottages. I want you to sit with that word for a second, cottage, because the buildings it described included a house called the Breakers, built for the Vanderbilt family, 70 rooms, a great hall modelled loosely on an Italian Renaissance palace, ceilings painted by imported artists, a dining room ceiling alone that took specialists more than a year to complete, another, called Marble House, built by the same family a few years earlier, used, by some estimates, more marble than had gone into several actual European palaces, and cost, in 1890s dollars, an amount that would represent a genuinely staggering fortune by any measure, ancient or modern. These were the cottages. The word was not chosen by accident. It was chosen precisely because calling a 70-room marble palace a cottage was its own small knowing joke, a piece of insider language that separated people who understood the joke from people who did not, which is, if you think about it, more or less what this entire social world was built to do at every level, from the folded card corner up to the marble ballroom. The Newport season ran roughly from July through the end of August, and during those 8 or 9 weeks an entire parallel city assembled itself along a few miles of coastline, filled with almost exactly the same people who spent the rest of the year on Fifth Avenue, performing almost exactly the same rituals, the calls, the dinners, the balls, only now with the added spectacle of the ocean as a backdrop, and for a few hours most afternoons, a strange democratic ritual called the coaching parade, in which the wealthiest families paraded their carriages, their horses, and themselves along Bellevue Avenue for the benefit of anyone who cared to stand on the sidewalk and watch. And people did stand and watch, in real numbers, ordinary Newport residents and tourists gathering along the route specifically to see the rich pass by, a strange early ancestor if you squint at it, of the kind of celebrity watching we still do today, except conducted at the leisurely pace of a horse-drawn carriage instead of the speed of a phone screen. Now let us talk about marriage, because if there was one project that every single ritual we have discussed so far was, in the end, quietly organized around, it was this one, and the way this world approached it is, I think, one of the strangest and most clear-eyed things about the entire era. A daughter's presentation to society, her debut, was not a birthday party in any sense we would recognize. It was closer to a product launch. A girl of 17 or 18, having spent years being groomed, literally and figuratively, in deportment, in music, in enough French and enough art history to hold a dinner conversation without embarrassing anyone, was introduced formally to society at a ball or a series of teas hosted by her mother, and from that evening onward she was, in the plainest possible terms, on the market. Her value in that market was calculated from several factors at once: her family's fortune, obviously, but also its history, how long the money had been in the family, whether it still carried the faint unwelcome smell of a factory or a mine. Her own beauty and accomplishments mattered, but arguably mattered less than the two factors just named, which is a fact that more than one clear-eyed mother of the period understood perfectly well and planned around accordingly. And here is where the story takes its strangest turn, because by the 1880s and 90s, a specific and highly organized transaction had developed between a certain kind of American fortune and a certain kind of European title. British and continental aristocratic families, many of them sitting on grand estates and ancient names, but increasingly thin actual bank accounts, thanks to falling agricultural rents and decades of maintaining enormous properties, needed capital. American families with vast new fortunes, but no title, no ancient name, no way to buy their way into the oldest tier of European society, wanted exactly that. So a trade emerged, almost mechanical in its logic: American money for European title, arranged frequently through matchmakers, both formal and social, who specialized in exactly this kind of introduction. The most famous case, and the one that still makes people wince a little when they hear the full details, involves a young woman named Consuelo Vanderbilt, daughter of that same Alva Vanderbilt, who forced her way into Mrs. Astor's good graces with the costume ball we talked about earlier. Consuelo, by her own later account, was in love with someone else entirely as a young woman, an American, and her mother, with a determination that several biographers describe as close to ruthless, arranged instead for her marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a match that came with a dowry reported in the millions, in exchange for the title of Duchess and a place, finally, permanently, at the absolute summit of the European aristocracy. Consuelo herself wrote, decades later, of being essentially locked in her room by her mother until she agreed to the engagement, forbidden even to see the man she had actually wanted to marry. The wedding itself, held in New York in 1895, was covered breathlessly by newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, described in a level of material detail, the lace, the diamonds, the specific carriages, that reads today less like journalism and more like an inventory. And the marriage, unsurprisingly perhaps, given how it began, was not a particularly happy one. Consuelo and the Duke eventually separated, and she spoke in her later years with real, unvarnished honesty about what it had cost her to be, in essence, purchased into a title on her mother's behalf. She was not alone. Historians estimate that somewhere in the range of 100, possibly more, wealthy young American women married into the titled aristocracy of Britain and the European continent during this general period, enough of a pattern that the British press coined its own slightly mocking, slightly admiring term for them: dollar princesses. Some of these marriages, it should be said honestly, turned out well, built on genuine affection that grew alongside the financial arrangement. Winston Churchill's own mother, Jenny Jerome, was one of the earlier dollar princesses, an American who married into British aristocracy a generation before Consuelo, and that marriage, whatever its later complications, produced one of the most consequential political figures of the following century. But plenty of these matches were, at their core, exactly what Consuelo's was: a transaction between two families conducted through the bodies and futures of very young women who were, in an era that considered itself the very height of civilization and refinement, rarely asked for much of an opinion on the matter at all. I want to bring you back inside the house for a while, to show you something about the architecture itself, the actual physical bones of these Fifth Avenue mansions and Newport cottages, because the buildings were designed quite deliberately around one particular obsession, and that obsession was making the labor that ran the household completely, seamlessly invisible. Think about a house like the Breakers for a moment. 70 rooms, a full staff numbering in the dozens, cooking and cleaning and coal hauling and laundry and flower arranging and silver polishing happening constantly, every hour of every day, and yet a guest moving through the public rooms of that house, the great hall, the dining room, the music room, was meant to encounter almost none of it directly. This was achieved through an entire secondary architecture, a shadow house layered invisibly inside the visible one. Back stairs, narrow and unadorned, ran between floors specifically so servants could move from the kitchen in the basement to the bedrooms on the third floor without ever crossing a main hallway a family member might be using. Dumbwaiters, small mechanical lifts operated by rope, or, in the more advanced houses, small electric motors, carried food and coal and linens vertically through the walls themselves, so that a tray of afternoon tea could arrive in a parlor without anyone having visibly carried it there at all, appearing, as far as the physics of the room suggested, almost by magic. Bells were the nervous system of this arrangement. A panel in the kitchen or the servants' hall, sometimes an entire wall of small numbered indicators, corresponded to pull cords or buttons installed discreetly in every room of the house, so that a family member could summon a specific servant to a specific room without raising their voice, without leaving their chair, without doing anything more than reaching toward a small brass fitting near the fireplace. The system meant a servant's entire working day was organized around a kind of constant, dispersed attentiveness, always half listening for a particular bell, and it meant the family, in turn, almost never had to think about where a given servant physically was at any moment, only that when the bell was pulled, someone would, within a minute or two, simply appear, and the servants themselves were trained, quite explicitly, in a kind of practiced invisibility, even when they were directly in the room. A well-trained parlour maid served at table without making eye contact with the guests, moved along the wall rather than through open floor space whenever possible, and spoke, if she spoke at all, only when a direct question required a direct answer, and even then in as few words as the situation allowed. Footmen serving at a formal dinner were instructed to anticipate needs before they were voiced, refilling a glass, clearing a plate, all without a word exchanged, so that the actual mechanics of service seemed to happen almost on their own, the way weather happens on its own, present and necessary, and somehow not quite the business of the people it was serving. There is a detail from several household manuals of the period that I find, honestly, a little chilling, though I want to be careful not to overstate it, because it is also, in its own strange way, simply a fact about how work was organized then. Servants were very often addressed only by their first names, regardless of their age, sometimes not even their own first names, but a name assigned to the position itself, so that a household might employ several parlour maids across the years, each one called, for the duration of her employment, by the same name her predecessor had used, a practice that stripped away, quite deliberately, the individual identity of the person doing the work and replaced it with a function that work performed. A woman might spend 15 years of her actual life being called by a name that was not technically hers at all, below stairs. Meanwhile, a strict internal hierarchy governed everything, arguably almost as rigid as the one governing the family upstairs. A butler or a housekeeper sat at the top of this shadow society, commanding real authority over dozens of employees beneath them, deciding who ate where in the servants' hall, who sat near the head of the table and who sat toward the foot, an entire miniature aristocracy operating in the basement of a house whose upstairs residents rarely gave it a second thought. The servants' own quarters, tucked into attics or basements, were, almost without exception, far plainer and far colder than anything above them. Small iron beds, minimal heating, a single shared washstand for a floor of 6 or 8 bedrooms, a nightly reminder, if any of them needed one, of exactly which world they belonged to, and exactly which one they merely helped run. A formal dinner in this world deserves its own careful unpacking, because the sheer scale of it tends to surprise people who assume, reasonably enough, that dinner is dinner regardless of the century. A fashionable dinner party at a New York mansion, or at Delmonico's, the restaurant that essentially functioned as this society's unofficial dining headquarters for decades, could run to 12 courses, sometimes 14, served across 3 or 4 hours, each course paired with its own wine, each wine served in its own specific glass, so that a single place setting might include 6 or 7 different pieces of stemware lined up in careful order, plus a similarly daunting array of flatware, sometimes 20 or more individual pieces per guest, a different fork for fish, a different fork for salad, a different fork for the ice course, a specific small blunt knife whose only purpose was cutting soft cheese. Learning to move correctly through this table was, for a young woman entering society, a genuine skill, taught explicitly, practiced at home before a girl was ever allowed to sit through a real formal dinner in public. The rule of thumb passed down in most etiquette manuals was to work from the outside in, course by course, trusting that whichever fork or spoon sat farthest from the plate was meant for whatever came first. But the rule broke down often enough in practice, with unfamiliar foods or unusual courses, that real fluency required something closer to memorization than logic, and certain foods carried their own separate, very specific rules that had nothing to do with the outside in principle at all. Asparagus, for instance, was in this period still commonly eaten with the fingers rather than a fork, lifted by the stalk and dipped, a detail that startles people today precisely because it runs against everything else we associate with this era's obsession with formality. A small, deliberate island of permitted messiness inside an otherwise merciless system of rules. Dessert, in a house that could afford it, frequently arrived as a kind of engineering marvel rather than simply a sweet course. Ice sculptures, carved by specialists hired specifically for a single evening, might depict a swan, a cupid, an entire miniature temple, melting slowly under the gaslight or the new electric bulbs as the meal progressed, so that the centerpiece a guest admired at the start of dinner was visibly, deliberately, a slightly different shape by the time coffee was served, a strange quiet reminder, whether anyone consciously registered it or not, that even the most extravagant beauty in this world was built to be temporary. Spun sugar towers, pulled and shaped by pastry chefs trained specifically in the technique, rose sometimes several feet above the table, gleaming and impossibly fragile, destroyed within minutes once the meal reached its end, and nobody at the table thought this waste exactly. It was closer to the point. I want to pause here, actually, on a thought that keeps circling back through everything we have discussed tonight, this idea of built-in impermanence, because it appears again and again once you start looking for it. Flowers imported specifically for a single evening's centerpieces, arranged by professional florists working through the night, discarded the next morning. Gowns worn once, or perhaps twice, to a season's most important events, then set aside, sometimes altered and re-worn by a lady's maid rather than the lady herself, sometimes simply stored, an entire wardrobe's worth of beautifully made silk essentially retired after a handful of wearings. There is something almost philosophical buried inside all this excess, whether the people living it ever articulated it or not, a kind of quiet, expensive argument that beauty did not need to last to be worth creating. Weddings deserve a moment too, because a society wedding in this world was, in its own way, an even larger production than a dinner party or a ball, and it makes a strange kind of sense once you remember everything we have already discussed about marriage as, at heart, a transaction between families. The trousseau alone, the collection of clothing, linens, and household goods a bride assembled before her wedding, could take the better part of a year to prepare and could include in the wealthiest households dozens of gowns, hundreds of pieces of monogrammed linen, entire sets of silver and china chosen and ordered months in advance. Wedding gifts, rather than being opened privately, were frequently displayed, laid out on tables in a separate room during the reception itself, arranged deliberately so guests could walk through and view them, each gift labeled with the name of the giver, an arrangement that turned generosity itself into a kind of public performance, since everyone attending understood perfectly well that the value and prominence of your gift said something about your own standing relative to the family you were gifting it to. There is a particular kind of wonder attached to new technology in this era that is easy to forget about now, when almost nothing genuinely surprises us anymore, and I think it is worth sitting inside for a moment before we move on. Electric light, when it first began appearing in the grandest private homes in the early 1880s, was not simply a convenience, it was a spectacle in its own right, something people travelled specifically to witness. The Vanderbilt costume ball we discussed earlier, with Alice Vanderbilt's actual battery-powered torch, was in part a demonstration of exactly this. Electricity treated not as a utility, but as a kind of controlled magic, something you might build an entire costume around specifically to show it off. J.P. Morgan had his Madison Avenue mansion wired for electric light in the early 1880s, one of the very first private residences in New York to be lit this way, and the process was, by several accounts, a genuine ordeal. A coal-fired generator installed on the property itself, the noise and occasional smell of it a real nuisance to neighbors, and more than one small fire reported in the house's early wiring, the technology still crude enough that lighting your home this way carried a real tangible risk alongside its glamour. And yet families pursued it anyway, because to be among the first to have it said something specific and valuable about who you were, in exactly the same currency as the folded card corner or the marble ballroom. The telephone arrived into wealthy households on a similar curve, treated initially less as a practical tool than as a novelty to be demonstrated for guests. A small crowd gathering around the device the way people might gather around a magic trick, passing the receiver hand to hand to hear a voice arriving, impossibly, from somewhere else in the city. Etiquette manuals took years to catch up with the device at all, and when they did, they treated it with real suspicion, warning against using the telephone for anything beyond brief, practical messages, considering an actual social conversation conducted by telephone to be faintly improper, lacking the physical presence that a real visit, with its cards and its careful 15 minutes, was understood to require. It is strange to think about now, a technology we treat as barely worth noticing once having been considered slightly rude to use for anything more than the briefest necessity. Children in this world lived a different life entirely, one that looked almost nothing like their parents', and in some ways nothing like childhood as we would recognize it today either. A wealthy Gilded Age child, from infancy, was raised largely by paid staff rather than by their own parents directly. A wet nurse in the earliest months, if the mother did not nurse the child herself, which many fashionable women did not, considering it, by this point in the century, somewhat old-fashioned and physically taxing. Then a nursemaid, and as the child grew, a governess for a girl, or a tutor for a boy, occupying the nursery floor of the house almost as its own separate small household, with its own schedule, its own meals, its own rules, largely disconnected from the rhythms of the adults below. In the wealthiest families, children were often brought down to see their parents for a single, carefully managed hour in the late afternoon, bathed, dressed in their best clothes, presented briefly in the drawing room the way a finished piece of work might be presented, and then returned upstairs to the nursery for supper and bed, while the adult household moved on into its evening of calls and dinners and theatre. This was not considered neglect at the time, or at least not by the people practicing it. It was considered, in fact, the correct and responsible way to raise a child of standing, on the theory that consistency, discipline, and a controlled environment mattered more to a child's development than constant parental presence, and that the parents themselves, occupied as they were with the genuine labor of maintaining the family's social position, were simply not the right people, temperamentally or practically, to manage the daily grind of a small child's care. Some of these arrangements produced real affection between children and the staff who actually raised them, bonds that lasted lifetimes, grown men and women writing decades later, with real tenderness, about a childhood nurse who had been, in every functional sense, far closer to a parent than their own mother or father ever were, and some of these same men and women wrote, with a very different tone, about a specific kind of loneliness that came from growing up inside a beautiful house, surrounded by more material comfort than almost anyone alive could imagine, and still feeling, most days, faintly like a guest in their own home, while the women of this world were building their identities out of calling cards and morning brooches and 15-minute conversations. The men of the same families occupied a genuinely separate universe, one built around institutions the women were, almost without exception, formally barred from entering at all. The Gentlemen's Club sat at the centre of this world, buildings like the Union Club or the Knickerbocker Club, grand in their own right though usually more austere than the mansions their members went home to, filled with leather chairs and reading rooms and dining rooms where business, real business, mergers and railroad deals, and stock arrangements worth more than entire fortunes, was quietly conducted over cigars and brandy, in an atmosphere of studied, unhurried calm. Membership in the right club mattered almost as much for a man's standing as an invitation to Mrs. Astor's ballroom mattered for his wife, and the process of getting in was its own small drama, involving sponsorship from existing members, a formal application, and a blackball system in which a small number of negative votes, sometimes as few as 1 or 2, could quietly and permanently end a man's chances, often without him ever being told exactly why or by whom. A rejected application was itself a kind of social information, whispered about carefully, and a man who had been blackballed from one club generally found his path into any comparable club considerably harder afterward, the rejection following him the way a bad debt might follow him, on a ledger nobody showed him directly but that everyone in his world could somehow read. Inside these clubs, an entirely different set of rituals governed the day. Long lunches that stretched into the late afternoon, card games, whist most commonly, played for stakes that could run into real money over the course of an evening, a kind of easy, performative masculinity that had its own strict rules about what could be discussed and how, financial troubles mentioned only obliquely, personal matters almost never mentioned at all. The whole atmosphere built around projecting an effortless, unbothered competence regardless of what was actually happening underneath it. It is worth saying, because it is easy to forget once you have spent a while inside the women's side of this story, that the men of this world were performing their own version of the same exhausting theatre, just in a different register, with cigars instead of calling cards and blackballs instead of cuts direct. I want to return to the women's evening, though, and actually walk you through a ball from the inside, in real detail, rather than simply describing it from a distance. And I think this is a good moment to slow down and let the scene breathe a little. Picture a young woman, let us say her name is Florence, 19 years old, in her second season now, no longer quite the novelty she was the year before, but not yet settled into any particular fate either, still very much in the active, uncertain middle of the marriage market we discussed earlier. She arrives at a ball on Fifth Avenue at around 10 in the evening, considerably later than we might now consider fashionable for a party to properly begin, dressed in a gown her mother selected with as much strategic thought as a general choosing terrain for a battle, pale colours still being considered most appropriate for an unmarried girl, the fabric light enough to move well through the dances she will be expected to perform correctly and repeatedly over the coming hours. Florence carries a small dance card, a folded paper booklet with a tiny attached pencil, on which the names of her partners for each individual dance of the evening will be written, sometimes arranged in advance by her mother or a hostess working carefully to ensure Florence is neither left conspicuously empty for too many dances in a row, which would read publicly as a small social failure, nor monopolized too heavily by any single young man, which would spark exactly the kind of gossip Florence's mother has spent the entire season trying to manage in the opposite direction. A chaperone, usually the mother herself or another trusted married woman, sits along the wall for the entire evening, present at every moment, because an unmarried girl of Florence's class was, without real exception, never left alone in mixed company, not for a private conversation, not for a walk in a garden, not even, in the strictest households, for a carriage ride home without a chaperone present the entire way. The dances themselves followed a strict order, printed in advance on a programme, opening most commonly with a formal quadrille or a polonaise, a slow, stately processional dance whose primary function was almost ceremonial, allowing the hostess to lead the assembled guests around the room once before the real dancing began. Everyone's position in the procession itself a small, silent statement about their standing relative to everyone else present. The waltz, by this point in the century, had become respectable enough to appear regularly on the programme, though it had scandalized an earlier generation badly enough that some older chaperones along the wall still watched it with a faint, remembered disapproval. This dance that involved a young man's hand resting at a young woman's waist for minutes at a stretch, in full view of the room, which had once seemed, to their own mothers, almost indecently intimate. Between dances, Florence would be escorted back to her chaperone by her partner, offered perhaps a glass of lemonade or a small ice, and the conversation during these brief intervals mattered nearly as much as the dancing itself, because this, more than almost any other moment in her carefully managed season, was one of the few settings in which she might exchange even a few unsupervised sentences with a young man her family considered a suitable match. Everything about the exchange was watched, if not directly by her chaperone, then indirectly by the dozens of other mothers and aunts and older sisters positioned around the edges of the room, all of them quietly cataloguing who danced with whom, how many times, with what apparent enthusiasm, information that would circulate through the calling card network for weeks afterward, with a speed and thoroughness that would put most modern gossip to shame. Supper was served around midnight, often in a separate room, an elaborate cold buffet of lobster and terrapin and champagne, and by the time Florence's carriage finally collected her and her mother in the small hours of the morning, the sky already beginning to grey toward dawn in some accounts, she would have danced perhaps a dozen times, spoken carefully calibrated sentences to a dozen different young men, and contributed, whether she felt it in the moment or not, another small data point to the slow, ongoing calculation of her own eventual marriage. She would sleep past noon the next day, and the whole performance would begin again within a night or two at another house, another ballroom, another version of the same evening, for the length of an entire winter season that could run from November through Lent, dozens of these evenings strung together into a single, exhausting, glittering marathon. I think what strikes me most, turning this scene over in my mind, is how much genuine skill it required, how much Florence had to hold in her head at once, which partners to favor and which to gently discourage, how to seem effortlessly charming while tracking a dozen small social calculations simultaneously, and how almost none of that skill would ever be named as skill by the world she was performing it inside. It would simply be called being a nice girl or being well brought up, language that flattens an enormous amount of real, exhausting labor into something that sounds, on the surface, like it required no effort at all. Now let me take you somewhere a little different, because not every family inside this world sat comfortably at its center, and I think the story is more honest if we spend some time with a family still trying to get in, rather than one already settled at the top. Maybe you are tonight a woman named Harriet, and your husband made his fortune not in railroads or old shipping money but in something newer, something a little more industrial, meat packing perhaps, or a patent on a piece of manufacturing equipment that happened to be needed by half the country at exactly the right moment. You have more money in strict dollar terms than several of the families who will not receive you. Your house on Fifth Avenue, 3 years old now, cost more to build than some of the older mansions around it, and yet your calling tray sits nearly empty most Thursdays, and you know exactly why, even if nobody has ever said it to your face. Your money is too new. It still, in the delicate language of this world, smells faintly of the factory. Harriet has tried, over these 3 years, nearly everything the guidebooks and the more sympathetic older women in her circle have quietly suggested. She hired a social secretary, a woman with connections of her own, specifically to help manage the correct order of calls, the correct wording of invitations, the correct way to seat a dinner table so that no guest is placed beneath their actual rank, a mistake that could offend deeply and be remembered for years. She gave last winter a dinner so carefully considered in every detail, the flowers, the menu, the seating, that even a columnist from one of the society papers mentioned it favorably, a small, hard-won victory that Harriet kept the clipping of for weeks afterward, tucked into a drawer, taken out and reread more than once. And still, the invitations she wants most, the ones from the oldest 10 or 12 families, the ones whose approval would finally, permanently, settle the question of where she belongs, have not come. Her daughter, 16 now and growing quickly toward her own debut, watches her mother's careful campaign with a kind of quiet, complicated attention, old enough to understand what is happening even if nobody explains it to her directly, young enough to still hope, in the specific way only a 16-year-old can hope that things might simply work out because they ought to. There is something genuinely poignant in Harriet's position, I think. Something that the more famous stories of triumphant new money breaking through, the Vanderbilts and their costume ball, tend to obscure. For every family that eventually forced its way in through sheer scale and persistence, there were dozens more who spent years, sometimes an entire generation, circling the edges of this world, without ever quite being let inside it. Their money perfectly real, their houses perfectly grand, their manners, by any reasonable measure, perfectly correct, and still, somehow, not enough. The system was never really about manners in the end, whatever the etiquette manuals claimed. It was about time, about the specific, unteachable prestige of money that had simply been present long enough that nobody quite remembered how it arrived. The newspapers made a healthy business out of exactly this tension, and I think it is worth pausing on the press itself for a moment, because the gossip and society columns of this era functioned as something close to a parallel governing body, with real power over reputations and, indirectly, over money itself. Papers ran detailed accounts of who attended which ball, wearing what, seated where, sometimes down to a description of a single gown's fabric and trim. Information gathered through a network of servants paid quietly for details, through guest lists leaked deliberately by hostesses eager for coverage, and through society reporters who were, in the more prominent cases, themselves half accepted into the world they covered, invited to certain events specifically because their coverage could make or damage a hostess's standing overnight. Ward McAllister, the man who helped Mrs. Astor compile her list of the 400, became something close to a minor celebrity in his own right through exactly this mechanism, quoted constantly in the papers, treated as a kind of high priest of correct behavior, until, in a turn that delighted his many quiet enemies, he overplayed his hand by publishing a memoir revealing considerably more of society's inner workings than the people inside it wanted made public, and found himself, within a few short years, cut out of the very world he had spent decades helping to define. There is a lesson in that story that I think this entire world, for all its rules, never quite managed to teach its own members, which is that a system built entirely on carefully managed appearances is, by its very nature, unstable, vulnerable at any moment to someone simply deciding to say the quiet part out loud. Health deserves its own stretch of tonight's story, because wealth in this era brought access to an entire specialized world of spas, resorts, and treatments built around the very particular anxieties of people who had, for the first time in their family's history, enough leisure to actually worry about their bodies as a full-time occupation. Saratoga Springs in upstate New York had, by the middle of the century, become one of the most fashionable destinations in the country, built originally around the genuine mineral springs that gave the town its name, waters that Gilded Age visitors drank in careful, prescribed quantities each morning, believing them capable of curing everything from digestive trouble to nervous exhaustion to a vague fashionable malady simply called biliousness. The daily ritual at a place like Saratoga had its own strict choreography, not unlike the 15-minute call back in the city. Guests rose early, walked to one of the mineral springs, drank a specified number of glasses of the water, often unpleasantly sulphurous in taste, then returned to their hotel for an elaborate breakfast, spent the middle of the day at leisure, walking the grounds, playing croquet, observing and being observed by the hundreds of other wealthy families doing precisely the same thing, and gathered each evening for dinner and dancing in hotel ballrooms nearly as grand as anything in New York itself. The horse racing at Saratoga, too, became a fixture of the summer social calendar, an event where fortunes changed hands on the track, while in the grandstands, an entirely separate and equally serious competition played out over who was seen with whom, wearing what, in whose company. Europe, too, pulled at this world with real force, and a certain kind of wealthy American family organized entire years around a seasonal migration that took them from New York in the winter to Newport in the summer, and then, for a stretch of weeks or months in between, across the Atlantic entirely, to Paris for the dressmakers, to London for the season, sometimes to a spa town on the continent, Baden-Baden or Vichy or Carlsbad, where European aristocracy and wealthy Americans mingled in a setting that felt to the Americans at least, like a genuine step up the ladder they had spent all winter climbing at home. Paris, in particular, held a specific, almost sacred status because a gown made by the right Parisian house, worth being the single most coveted name of the era, carried a prestige no American dressmaker, however skilled, could fully replicate. Wealthy American women would sit for fittings that could stretch across weeks, ordering not one gown but an entire season's wardrobe at once, dozens of pieces shipped back across the Atlantic in specially packed trunks, insured for sums that would have supported a working family for years. The strangeness of all this travel, when you actually sit with it, is how much effort went into simply moving the apparatus of status from one location to another without ever really pausing it. A family crossing the Atlantic did not stop performing their social role during the crossing itself. The finest transatlantic liners of the era offered accommodations and social rituals nearly as elaborate as anything on land. Formal dinners at the captain's table, promenade decks where passengers walked and were observed exactly as they had been observed on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, a floating extension of the same world, simply relocated temporarily onto water, and running underneath all of this, quietly, constantly, was the question of health in a more literal sense, because for all the era's obsession with leisure and display, illness was a real and constant presence in these households. Tuberculosis especially, which struck across every social class but which fashionable medicine of the period sometimes treated with an unsettling kind of aesthetic admiration, a pale, wasting thinness that overlapped, uncomfortably, with the era's own beauty ideals, the same pallor sought after with arsenic wafers arriving, in genuine illness, as something closer to a death sentence. Wealthy families sent sick relatives to sanatoriums in mountain air, in the Adirondacks or in Colorado, chasing a cure that medicine of the time could not reliably offer, spending enormous sums on treatments, rest, controlled diets, fresh air regimens, that sometimes helped and sometimes did nothing at all, watching, in either case, with a kind of helpless attentiveness that no amount of money could fully resolve. It is a useful thing to remember, I think, whenever this era starts to sound purely absurd or purely enviable, that death moved through these houses exactly as freely as it moved through any other house in the country, indifferent to the marble floors and the imported silk. I want to take you into a wardrobe now, because I think clothing tells you more about the texture of daily life in this world than almost anything else we could examine, and I have not yet told you the full extent of how many outfits a single day actually required. A woman of Adelaide's or Florence's standing did not simply get dressed in the morning and remain dressed until bed. She changed clothing completely, multiple times across a single ordinary day, each outfit specific to its exact activity, and failing to change appropriately was considered nearly as much a breach of etiquette as failing to leave a card with the correct folded corner. The morning began with a simple wrapper or dressing gown, worn only in the privacy of the bedroom while hair and toilette were completed. This was followed by a walking dress or morning dress for the early part of the day, practical enough for a stroll or errands but still fully structured, boned and finished. If the afternoon included receiving calls, as we saw with Adelaide, a different dress again was required, slightly more formal, chosen specifically for sitting rather than walking, the fabric and cut different enough that an experienced eye could tell at a glance whether a woman was dressed for morning business or afternoon reception. If the afternoon included making calls rather than receiving them, a carriage dress was called for, cut to look elegant while seated in an open or closed carriage, with particular attention paid to how the fabric would appear when arranged across a carriage seat. By late afternoon, if there were any activity requiring outdoor movement, a walking suit might be required yet again, and as evening approached, the process began anew with a dinner dress, cut lower at the neckline than anything worn earlier in the day, in richer fabric, paired with different jewelry entirely, because jewelry, too, followed its own rules of appropriateness by hour and occasion. Simpler pieces for daytime, the family's finest stones reserved exclusively for evening. If the evening included a ball, yet another change was required, a ball gown distinct even from the dinner dress, lighter, more elaborate, built specifically to move well through hours of dancing. A woman attending a full formal dinner, followed immediately by a ball, might change her entire outfit, gown, jewelry, sometimes even her hairstyle, as many as 5 or 6 times between waking and finally undressing for bed past midnight. Each of these changes required real time and real labor, not from the woman alone but from her lady's maid, whose entire working day was organized around exactly this rhythm of dressing and undressing, lacing and unlacing, pinning and unpinning hair that might need to be rebuilt from scratch for the evening even after being carefully arranged that same morning. A skilled lady's maid like the one we met earlier in this story understood not merely how to fasten a row of hooks, but how to read her mistress's schedule days in advance, laying out the correct sequence of garments before she was ever asked, anticipating a dinner party's demands, a morning obligation's demands, a sudden change in weather that might require an entirely different carriage dress than the one originally planned. And underneath every one of these outer garments sat a layer of underclothing so extensive it is worth naming in full, if only because the sheer quantity of it tends to surprise people who assume Victorian and Gilded Age dressing was primarily about the visible gown. A chemise first, a light cotton or linen undergarment worn against the skin, drawers over that, a corset, laced by the maid, tightened in careful stages rather than all at once, because pulling the laces too quickly could genuinely injure a woman, bruise the ribs, restrict breathing too suddenly. Over the corset, 1 or more petticoats, sometimes 3 or 4 layered together, each contributing its own volume and shape to the silhouette the outer dress was designed to display. By the 1880s, a bustle, a structured pad or frame worn at the back beneath the petticoats, projected the fashionable silhouette of the moment, a shape that would itself shift dramatically across the decades we are discussing tonight, ballooning enormously in the mid-1880s before nearly vanishing again by the following decade, each shift requiring an entirely new wardrobe rather than a simple alteration of the old one. The total weight of a fully dressed, fashionable woman in outdoor winter clothing, corset and petticoats and bustle, and the outer gown itself, sometimes trimmed with fur or heavy beading, could run to a genuinely surprising number of pounds, enough that more than one etiquette writer of the period commented, with a kind of resigned practicality, on the specific stamina required simply to remain upright and graceful through an entire afternoon of calls while carrying that much structured fabric across her own frame. It is worth remembering, whenever the image of languid Gilded Age leisure comes to mind, that even standing still in this world was, quite literally, a form of physical labor. We can go down to the kitchen for a while now, because we have spent a great deal of time upstairs tonight, in the ballrooms and the dressing rooms and the drawing rooms, and the sheer scale of what it took to feed a household like this deserves its own real attention. A grand New York or Newport kitchen, operated on a scale closer to a small commercial restaurant than to anything we would recognize as ordinary home cooking, staffed by a chef, often French or trained in the French tradition, since French cuisine carried the same prestige in the kitchen that a Worth gown carried in the wardrobe, along with a small brigade of assistant cooks, a pastry chef for the desserts and the spun sugar towers we discussed earlier, kitchen maids for the endless washing and chopping and plucking, and a scullery maid at the very bottom of this particular hierarchy, whose entire day was organized around the pots and pans and the coal-fired range that needed constant tending. A single formal dinner for 20 guests, with its 12 or 14 courses, required a level of coordination that is genuinely difficult to picture from this distance. Dozens of separate dishes needing to reach the table at precisely the correct temperature and in precisely the correct order, timed against a household's worth of footmen carrying trays up narrow back stairs or through dumbwaiters, every plate cleared and replaced without a single visible hitch in the rhythm of the evening above. The chef's reputation, and by extension a household's reputation, rested entirely on this invisible choreography going perfectly every single time, and a talented French chef in this era could command a salary rivaling that of a mid-level bank manager, poached from household to household by families competing, quite openly, for the prestige a truly excellent kitchen could confer. Ice, in the era before household refrigeration as we would understand it, arrived by a completely separate supply chain, cut from frozen lakes and rivers upstate during the winter, packed in sawdust, and shipped down to the city to be stored in large insulated ice boxes in the kitchen and pantry, a delivery so routine that an iceman's regular visits became one of the quiet, unremarked rhythms of the household's week, alongside the coal delivery that kept the ranges burning and the countless fireplaces warm through a New York winter. A household of this size could burn through an almost startling quantity of coal across a single cold season, delivered by cart, hauled by servants down into the basement, then carried up, bucket by bucket, to feed dozens of separate fireplaces across 4 or 5 floors, because central heating, where it existed at all in these decades, was still crude and unreliable enough that most rooms continued to rely on their own individual hearth. Correspondence, too, occupied a genuinely significant portion of a wealthy woman's day, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is easy to imagine a life like Adelaide's or Florence's mother's as entirely social, entirely spoken, when in fact an enormous amount of the actual work of maintaining a family's position happened silently at a writing desk in ink. Invitations had to be issued and answered within a specific, socially prescribed window, often no more than a day or two. A delay read immediately as either carelessness or a subtle insult, depending on the relationship involved. Condolence letters followed their own strict formulas, specific language, specific black-bordered stationery matching the exact stage of mourning being observed. Letters of introduction, a formal document one family member wrote on behalf of another, vouching for their character and standing, allowed a travelling woman to be properly received in a city or country where she was not personally known, essentially a portable, written version of the calling card system, carried across an ocean and presented, on arrival, to a hostess who had never laid eyes on the bearer before, but who trusted the name and reputation of whoever had written the letter enough to open her own door in response. A woman managing this correspondence for a large, socially active family might write, by some estimates drawn from surviving letter books of the period, dozens of individual letters across a single week, each one composed with real care, because a poorly worded note, a wrong form of address, an overly familiar tone taken with someone who expected more formality, could do real, lasting damage to a relationship that had taken years to build. This, too, was labour that the world around her declined to name as labour, filed instead under the vague, dismissive heading of correspondence, as though the actual skill and judgment required to manage it were somehow beneath serious mention. Bathing deserves a moment of its own, because the relationship this world had with cleanliness was, like almost everything else we have covered tonight, considerably stranger and more elaborate than you might assume. Full immersion bathing, in a proper bathroom with running water, was still, even in the wealthiest houses of the early 1880s, something closer to a special occasion than a daily habit, typically undertaken perhaps twice a week rather than every day, a practice that would strike most of us now as genuinely surprising, given how fastidious this world was about appearance in every other respect. The reasoning at the time was not laziness but a genuine widely held medical belief that overly frequent bathing, particularly in hot water, could weaken the body, strip away natural oils the skin needed, and leave a person more vulnerable to illness rather than less on the days between full baths. The washstand ritual we glimpsed earlier with Ellis and her basin of warm water handled the daily cleanliness of face, neck, hands, and whatever else required attention, a practice sometimes called a sponge bath, quicker, more private, requiring far less of the household's labour to arrange. By the 1890s, as plumbing technology improved, and as germ theory became more widely understood and accepted by physicians, attitudes shifted meaningfully, and daily bathing became increasingly common and increasingly fashionable among the wealthiest households, with some of the grandest new Newport cottages installing multiple bathrooms, elaborately tiled, fitted with the very latest fixtures imported from England, or built specially by American manufacturers eager to serve exactly this newly enthusiastic market. The bathroom itself, in a house like the Breakers, became almost its own small showpiece, marble surfaces, silver-plated fixtures, in some installations both fresh water and salt water taps, the salt water pumped directly from the ocean specifically, so residents could enjoy what contemporary medical opinion considered the particular restorative benefits of seawater without ever actually leaving the house. It is a small, telling detail, I think, this desire to bring the ocean indoors rather than simply walking the short distance to the actual shore, a house so completely organized around convenience and control that even nature itself was, wherever possible, piped in on demand rather than encountered directly. Let me tell you about a scandal now, because for all the careful, controlled surface of this world, scandal broke through it constantly, and the way it broke through tells you almost as much about the underlying rules as the etiquette manuals do. Newport in particular developed something of a reputation, whispered about more than printed directly in these early decades, for a level of romantic freedom among its wealthiest married residents that would have shocked the same people's more conservative relatives back in New York. Long, idle summer weeks, husbands frequently absent in the city attending to business during the week and arriving only for weekends, an entire community of bored, wealthy, unsupervised adults living in close proximity for months at a stretch, produced, unsurprisingly, more than a few genuine affairs, some of them eventually surfacing into full public divorce scandals that the newspapers covered with an appetite that makes clear just how much the public, even then, enjoyed watching this particular class of people fall from their own careful pedestals. Divorce itself carried a genuinely severe social cost for a woman in this world, far more severe than for a man in the same situation, an asymmetry the era rarely bothered to disguise or apologize for. A divorced woman, regardless of the specific circumstances, regardless of who had actually been at fault, often found her calling tray thinning noticeably within weeks, invitations quietly stopping, old friends suddenly, mysteriously, always engaged elsewhere when she tried to call. The most determined and wealthiest women could sometimes weather this, rebuild a version of their social standing over years through sheer persistence and sheer remaining fortune. But it was, without exception, an uphill fight, conducted against a set of rules that had never been written down anywhere but that everyone in the room somehow already knew. There is one particular ball I want to tell you about before we move toward the quieter part of the evening, because it captures, better than almost any other single event from this era, the exact moment when this world's careless excess collided head-on with the country around it, and the collision left a mark that never really faded. In February of 1897, a wealthy couple named Bradley and Cornelia Martin hosted a costume ball at the Waldorf Hotel that was intended, quite explicitly, to rival and even surpass the Vanderbilt ball we discussed earlier, guests arriving dressed as European royalty, as Marie Antoinette, as Mary Queen of Scots, an entire room of American citizens costumed, with total sincerity, as the aristocracy their own country had fought a revolution to escape. The timing could not have been worse, and the Martins, to their genuine and lasting cost, seemed to have simply failed to notice. The country was still climbing out of a serious economic depression that had begun in 1893, unemployment high, real hardship widespread across the working population of the very city where the ball was being held. When news of the planned event reached the papers, the public reaction was not the usual mixture of envy and fascination this world had grown used to. It was something closer to open fury. Newspapers ran editorials condemning the ball as a grotesque display of indifference to suffering happening blocks away. Clergymen preached against it from their pulpits the following Sunday. The Martins, reportedly startled and genuinely wounded by the scale of the backlash, found their social standing in New York permanently damaged by an event they had intended as the crowning achievement of their social career, and within a couple of years, facing continued public resentment and, in a smaller but real way, a genuine threat to Bradley Martin's business interests, the family left the country entirely, relocating to England, where American money, whatever its age, still carried enough novelty and welcome that they were able to rebuild a version of the standing they had lost at home. I find this story worth sitting with because it shows you the edge of the whole system we have spent this evening exploring, the exact point at which private extravagance, however normal it felt inside its own small world, ran up against a much larger public that had never agreed to consider any of it normal at all. The rules of the drawing room, the folded cards and the careful mourning stages and the 15-course dinners only worked as long as the room stayed relatively closed. The moment the outside world was allowed a clear, detailed look inside, the whole performance could curdle, almost overnight, from admired to obscene. And yet, and this is perhaps the strangest part of the whole story, the system barely paused. Other families continued hosting their own elaborate balls within a few short years of the Bradley Martin scandal. Dinners on horseback and dog dinners and gold cigarette papers continued appearing in the society pages well into the new century, because the private logic of this particular world, the folded corner and the calling tray and the 400 names in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, was simply too deeply embedded in how these families understood their own worth to be genuinely interrupted by one bad season of public opinion. It would take something considerably larger, a changing century, 2 world wars, an income tax that actually meant something, before the specific world we have spent tonight inside finally, slowly, came apart for good. There was one public ritual worth stepping back outside for, because it was a ritual in this world that actually did include everyone, rich and poor alike, standing shoulder to shoulder on the same sidewalk, and it happened every spring on Fifth Avenue. The Easter Parade, as it came to be called, began quite simply, wealthy churchgoers leaving services at St. Patrick's or Grace Church or one of the other fashionable Fifth Avenue congregations, and strolling home afterward in their new spring clothing. But by the 1880s and 90s it had grown into something considerably larger and stranger, an unofficial, unorganized fashion exhibition that drew crowds numbering in the tens of thousands, ordinary New Yorkers lining the sidewalks specifically to watch the wealthy walk past in their new hats and gowns. The whole avenue transformed for a single afternoon into something between a religious observance and a runway. The stakes of what to wear on this particular afternoon were, unsurprisingly, taken with tremendous seriousness inside the households we have been following tonight. An Easter bonnet ordered from the right milliner, trimmed with the season's correct combination of flowers or feathers, could take weeks to finalize, fittings and adjustments continuing right up until the final days before the holiday, because this single walk down the avenue functioned as a kind of public unveiling of the coming season's fashionable silhouette, reported on in exhaustive, almost forensic detail by the following morning's papers, which described, gown by gown, exactly who had worn what, and, more quietly, exactly who had not appeared at all, an absence that could spark its own small wave of speculation about illness, or financial trouble, or some other private difficulty a family might have preferred to keep entirely private. There is something I find genuinely charming about this one particular ritual, actually, more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, because unlike the calling cards or the 15-minute visits, conducted entirely within the closed world of the wealthy themselves, the Easter Parade was, in its own strange way, shared. The crowd on the sidewalk was not being excluded the way an unreceived caller was excluded. They were the audience, invited in effect, if only implicitly, to participate in the spectacle from the outside, and many of them clearly enjoyed the role enormously, returning year after year, developing their own informal expertise in reading a season's fashions, forming their own opinions about whose gown had truly triumphed that spring. A small, strange moment of genuine common culture stitched into the middle of a world otherwise built almost entirely around exclusion. Let me bring you back inside one more time, though, before we slow all the way down, because I want you to spend a few minutes with someone we have not yet properly met tonight, even though she has been present, quietly, in nearly every scene we have visited. Let us follow a lady's maid through a single ordinary day, someone we might call Nora, 26 years old, 5 years into service with the same family, sharing a small room on the top floor of a Fifth Avenue mansion with another maid whose bed sits close enough that the two of them can talk quietly after the lamp is out. Nora wakes at 5:30, well before her mistress will ring, because the earliest hours of her day belong entirely to preparation rather than service. She dresses quickly in the cold of the attic room, splashes her face with water from a pitcher that has sat overnight and lost most of whatever warmth it once had, and makes her way down the narrow back stairs to begin the long list of tasks that must be finished before the family wakes at all. Fires laid and lit in the bedrooms scheduled to be used that morning, the previous evening's gown brushed clean of any dust or spilled wine, checked carefully for a loose hem or a popped seam that will need mending before it can be worn again. The jewelry from the night before returned to its case, each piece checked against a small mental inventory Nora keeps without ever having been asked to, because a missing earring discovered at 9 in the morning is a crisis considerably worse than one caught and quietly resolved at 6. By the time the bell finally rings, Nora has already been awake and working for well over an hour, and the visible portion of her day, the brushing of hair, the lacing of the corset, the 90 minutes of morning toilet we walked through earlier with Adelaide and Ellis, is in some real sense simply the part of her labour that happens to have an audience. The much longer, much less visible remainder of her day, the mending, the packing for a coming trip, the careful laundering of delicate fabrics that cannot be trusted to the household's regular laundress, stretches on for another 12 or 13 hours past that, ending only once her mistress is finally undressed and settled for the night. Sometime well past midnight on an evening with a ball or a late dinner, Nora's evening finally winds down, and I want to leave her there for a moment, in the quiet of the dressing room after her mistress has gone to bed, because there is a particular hush that settles over a house like this once the family upstairs has finally truly gone to sleep, and the servants still awake in it move through the last of their tasks in a kind of practiced, unhurried silence, careful not to wake anyone with a dropped brush or a creaking floorboard. Food deserves one more moment, though, because I promised you Delmonico's earlier, and I never quite finished the thought. The restaurant, which by this point had several locations across the city, functioned as something close to neutral ground for this entire social world, a place grand enough to host the most important dinners of the season, and yet, tellingly, not attached to any single family's home, which made it useful for exactly the kind of event that needed to feel important without requiring the enormous private labour of hosting, though of course the restaurant's own kitchen and staff simply absorbed that labour instead, invisible to the guests in exactly the same way a private household staff was invisible. Certain dishes associated with Delmonico's became genuinely famous well beyond the restaurant's own walls, entering the broader culture in a way surprisingly few Gilded Age customs managed. Lobster Newburg, a rich dish of lobster meat in a sherry cream sauce, was reportedly developed at the restaurant after a sea captain suggested the recipe to the chef, and it became, within a few years, a fixture on fashionable menus across the entire country, a small, delicious piece of Gilded Age New York that genuinely did trickle outward into ordinary American life. Baked Alaska, a dessert built around the seemingly impossible trick of baking ice cream inside a hot meringue shell without melting it, delighted the era precisely because it seemed, on the plate, to violate basic physical law, ice cream arriving warm to the touch on the outside and perfectly frozen within, a small piece of edible theatre not unlike the ice sculptures and the spun sugar towers we talked about earlier, food built specifically to produce a gasp before it produced a bite. The precedence rules governing who sat where at a formal dinner deserve a proper mention too, because getting this wrong was one of the single most damaging errors a hostess could make. Seating followed rank, and rank in this world was calculated from a genuinely dense web of factors: a guest's title if they had one, their age, their husband's professional standing, whether they were a first-time guest in the house or a long-standing family friend, all weighed against each other by a hostess working, in the more difficult cases, with the help of a social secretary or an experienced older relative, because a guest seated too far from the head of the table, relative to their actual standing, could take real, lasting offence, sometimes never returning to that house again, a slight that might not even be mentioned directly, but that would nonetheless quietly, permanently thin out a family's calling list going forward. Married couples were, as a matter of firm rule, never seated together at a formal dinner, the theory being that a husband and wife saw quite enough of one another already, and that a proper dinner existed specifically to let each of them practice conversation with someone new, an arrangement that occasionally, if the placement went badly, produced an evening of real, quiet misery for whichever guest found themselves seated beside someone they simply could not stand. Engagement itself, once a match had finally been settled after however many seasons of calculated ballroom conversation, carried its own careful staging. A young woman did not typically wear her engagement ring in public immediately upon the proposal being accepted privately. There was, in many households, a brief interval during which the engagement remained a family matter only, formally announced afterward through a specific sequence, first told to close relatives, then announced more broadly through cards or a small notice in the papers, the ring itself appearing publicly only once this sequence had been properly completed, because an engagement announced out of the correct order, however small the deviation, could read as a kind of impropriety, a rush that suggested something slightly less than fully respectable about the match. There is one more story about exclusion and its consequences that I think belongs in tonight's collection, because it may be the single clearest example of how this entire world's rules about who belonged and who did not eventually reshaped the actual physical landscape of the city itself. For decades, the Academy of Music on 14th Street stood as New York's premier opera house, and its boxes, the most visible and prestigious seats in the building, were owned outright by a small number of the oldest families in the city, passed down through generations, essentially unavailable to purchase at any price if your family had not held one from the beginning. By the 1870s, a number of the city's newest and wealthiest families, the same families struggling for invitations to Mrs. Astor's ballroom, found themselves facing an identical wall at the opera house. Their fortunes, some of them considerably larger than the old families who held the boxes, simply could not buy them a seat because the seats were not for sale, and rather than continue waiting for an old guard that showed no signs of budging, a group of these new money families did something that still strikes me even now as one of the boldest moves in the entire era. They simply built their own opera house instead. The Metropolitan Opera opened in 1883, funded by exactly the families the Academy of Music had shut out, a building deliberately constructed to be grander, better appointed, and considerably more comfortable than its older rival. Its own tier of boxes, quickly nicknamed the Diamond Horseshoe for the sheer quantity of jewelry visible there on any given performance night, distributed among precisely the families who could not get a box at the Academy. The rivalry between the two houses lasted only a handful of seasons before the outcome became obvious to everyone involved. The Metropolitan's superior resources, its ability to hire the finest singers and stage the most lavish productions, simply outcompeted the older, more limited Academy, which closed its opera seasons for good within just a few years, unable to keep pace with an institution built, quite literally, out of spite and money in roughly equal measure. I love this story because it undercuts, just slightly, the picture of total helplessness that can creep into an evening like this one. This sense that the old rules of this world were simply an immovable wall the new money families had no choice but to quietly accept. Sometimes they did accept it, as we saw with Harriet, circling the edges of a world that never quite let her fully inside. But sometimes, when the wall was rigid enough and the resources were large enough, the new money simply built its own door, and built it so well that eventually the old door became irrelevant entirely. There is something almost reassuring in that, a reminder that even the most carefully maintained hierarchies of this era were in the end made of people and money and choices, not of anything actually permanent. Let me tell you briefly about honeymoons, because they too followed a specific recognizable pattern in this world, one considerably more elaborate than a simple wedding trip. A fashionable honeymoon of the period might last not days but weeks, sometimes months, an extended tour that could include Niagara Falls, already established by this point as the most popular honeymoon destination in the entire country, followed, for families with the means, by an extended trip to Europe, months spent moving between London and Paris and the Italian cities, visiting museums and cathedrals with a kind of obligatory thoroughness the era considered part of a proper, cultured marriage's beginning. The young couple travelled, in most cases, with at least one servant accompanying them, sometimes several, because even on a honeymoon, a fashionable young wife was not expected to dress her own hair or manage her own trunks, the labour of her life continuing, quietly, invisibly, even in the most private and supposedly romantic weeks of her entire year. Christmas in a house like this deserves its own telling, because the holiday, as this world celebrated it, had already taken on much of the shape we would recognize today. Decorated trees, gifts, family gatherings, but layered, as everything in this world was layered, with its own specific extravagance. A Fifth Avenue mansion's Christmas tree might stand nearly to the ceiling of a room already 15 or 20 feet tall, decorated not with the simple homemade ornaments common in less wealthy households, but with imported glass baubles from Germany, actual small candles clipped carefully to the branches, and lit only under close supervision for the brief glowing hour or two each evening the family gathered around it. A genuine fire risk that more than one household diary of the period mentions with a certain nervous awareness, a servant standing by with a bucket of water or sand for the entire duration the candles burned. Gifts for the children of the house could run to a genuinely staggering scale by the standards of the era. Elaborate dollhouses built as miniature replicas of actual mansions, complete down to tiny working doorbells in the more extravagant examples, mechanical toys imported from France and Germany, entire pony carts delivered as a single gift for a child fortunate enough to have parents willing to spend that kind of money on a single Christmas morning. And downstairs, the servants' Christmas looked considerably more modest, though a conscientious employer generally did provide some gift, a bonus, a length of good fabric, sometimes a genuinely thoughtful personal present chosen with real attention to a particular servant's situation, alongside a traditional Christmas dinner in the servants' hall that, on this one day of the year at least, might approach something closer to the quality and abundance of what the family upstairs was eating, a small, temporary softening of the rigid distinctions that governed every other day of the calendar. New Year's Day carried its own specific ritual in this world, one that has almost entirely vanished from American life today, called open house, or sometimes calling day, during which the usual rules about calling hours were briefly suspended, and wealthy families opened their homes to visits from essentially anyone within their social circle. Without the usual careful pre-arrangement, refreshments laid out, the household prepared to receive a steady stream of callers throughout the day, rather than the brief scheduled window of an ordinary Thursday. Young men in particular used the day to call on as many households as possible, sometimes a dozen or more in a single afternoon, a practice that produced its own minor social comedy. Exhausted young men arriving increasingly disheveled and increasingly full of whatever refreshments each previous house had offered, by the fourth or fifth call of the day. I want to tell you about one more figure before we start easing toward the end of tonight's story, because he represents a slightly different flavor of Gilded Age excess than anyone we have met so far. Less about inherited status and careful etiquette, and more about sheer, unapologetic appetite. A businessman known widely by the nickname Diamond Jim, who made his fortune in railroad supplies, became almost as famous for his personal habits as for his business dealings, reportedly capable of consuming meals of a scale that genuinely startled even his own era's generous standards. Multiple dozen oysters as a starter, followed by soup, then a course of fish, then 2 or 3 whole game birds, then a substantial steak, then vegetables, then dessert, sometimes several desserts, an entire evening's eating that contemporary accounts describe with a mixture of awe and mild horror. He was also known for a genuinely enormous personal collection of jewelry, which gave him his nickname in the first place, said to own dozens of complete sets of diamond-studded accessories, cufflinks and stick pins and watch chains, one full matching set for every day of the month, worn in careful rotation, a level of personal display that even other wealthy men of the era occasionally found excessive, which, given everything else we have discussed tonight, is itself a fairly remarkable thing to have accomplished. Let me tell you about the patriarch's balls before we move on, because they sit right at the intersection of nearly everything we have discussed tonight: exclusivity and etiquette, and the careful, deliberate manufacturing of scarcity as a form of status. Organized by Ward McAllister, the same man who helped compile Mrs. Astor's list of 400 names, the patriarch's balls were a series of exclusive dances held each winter, hosted not by a single family but by a small committee of about 25 men, the patriarchs themselves, each of whom was permitted to invite a strictly limited number of guests. The point, McAllister explained openly at the time, was not simply to have a party, but to definitively settle, once and for all, precisely who belonged to society and who did not, an invitation to a patriarch's ball functioning as something close to an official certificate of social existence, in a way that even Mrs. Astor's own annual ball, grand as it was, did not quite manage on its own. The balls themselves were held at Delmonico's, decorated elaborately for the occasion, and attendance was watched and reported with an intensity that seems at this distance almost comic, newspapers printing full guest lists the following morning, and the absence of an expected name from that list sparking exactly the kind of quiet, damaging speculation we have already discussed in other contexts tonight. McAllister ran this entire operation with a seriousness that several of his contemporaries found faintly ridiculous even at the time, one prominent socialite reportedly remarking that watching him manage a guest list was rather like watching a general plan a military campaign for a war that existed only in his own head, and yet the war, however invented, had real, tangible consequences for the people caught inside it. Careers and marriages and entire families' social futures genuinely shaped by decisions made in rooms exactly like the ones McAllister presided over. Summer brought its own version of this same competitive spectacle to Newport in the form of yacht racing, which by the 1890s had become one of the wealthy world's most visible and expensive hobbies. Entire fortunes poured into building and racing yachts competing for the America's Cup, a trophy that had by this point been held by American syndicates for decades against repeated, increasingly determined challenges from British yacht clubs. A single Cup Defender yacht could cost to design, build and campaign for a single racing season, a sum that would have supported an ordinary family for several lifetimes. And the men who funded these boats did so with a competitive intensity that mirrored, almost exactly, their wives' careful maneuvering through the ballroom, a parallel arena where the exact same families competed for exactly the same kind of prestige, just measured now in knots and hull design rather than folded card corners. There is a smaller, quieter ritual I want to mention too, before we start easing all the way down into the rest of tonight, because it involves a kind of care that stands in genuine contrast to some of the colder etiquette we have discussed. The correct way to introduce two people who did not already know each other was, in this world, a matter of real and careful judgment, because an introduction implied a kind of social vouching, one person effectively telling both parties that the other was worth knowing, and a poorly considered introduction, connecting someone to a person they later regretted knowing, could reflect badly on whoever had made the match in the first place. A hostess introducing two guests at a dinner or a ball was expected to consider in the moment whether the two people were likely to actually get along, whether their respective standings were compatible enough that neither would feel either elevated or diminished by the connection. A small act of social matchmaking performed dozens of times across a single evening, usually without either party ever realizing quite how much thought had gone into the 2 or 3 seconds it took to say their names to each other. Church, too, carried its own quiet system of hierarchy, one that might surprise people who assume a house of worship would sit outside the usual social calculations of this world. Fashionable Fifth Avenue congregations, Grace Church and St. Thomas and a handful of others, operated for much of this period on a pew rental system, in which families paid essentially for the right to occupy a specific pew, and the price of that pew, along with its physical location relative to the altar, tracked, almost exactly, the family's broader social standing. The oldest, wealthiest families held pews near the front, visible to the entire congregation, passed down through a family across generations the same way a box at the Academy of Music had once been passed down, while families newer to the congregation, or simply less prosperous, sat further back, a visible, weekly reminder, whether anyone intended it that way or not, of exactly where each family stood relative to its neighbours. Sunday itself followed its own careful rhythm in these households, morning service attended in the appropriate pew, in appropriately restrained clothing, since Sunday fashion, unlike a ball gown or a dinner dress, was expected to convey a certain modesty regardless of how much the fabric itself might have cost. After the service, the 15-minute call system briefly reappeared in a slightly different form, families exchanging brief greetings on the church steps or the sidewalk outside, a compressed, public version of the same social sorting that happened at greater length in the parlour on a Thursday afternoon, before everyone dispersed home for a family dinner that was, by the standards of this world, relatively modest and relatively private, one of the few meals across the entire week not primarily organized around being seen. I want to return now to the people we have spent this evening with, because I think their stories deserve a proper close rather than simply trailing off into the next fact, and there is something in returning to them that feels to me like the right way to bring tonight all the way down toward rest. Adelaide, whom we left in her front parlour receiving Mrs. Pruitt's careful reconnaissance about her daughter's coming debut, did in fact present that daughter the following autumn, a season that went by every measure that mattered in this world quite well, the girl dancing enough times at enough of the right balls, receiving enough of the right kind of attention, that within 2 years she was engaged to a young man from a family every bit as established as Adelaide's own, a match Adelaide had been quietly steering toward for the better part of 3 years, without her daughter ever fully realizing how much careful engineering had gone into the outcome, that eventually felt, to the daughter herself, simply like falling in love at the right ball. Florence, a young woman with the dance card and the pale gown, had a slightly more complicated path. A second season that went well enough but not spectacularly. A third season in which she began to feel, in the particular way a woman in her exact position could feel it, that certain doors were quietly closing rather than opening, and an eventual marriage, in her fourth season, to a man who was kind and reasonably well situated, though not the brilliant match her mother had once hoped for. Whether Florence herself considered this outcome a disappointment, or simply a reasonable, workable resolution to a process she had grown genuinely tired of by then, is not something the historical record can tell us with any certainty, and I think that uncertainty is in its own way honest. Not every story from this world resolved into either triumph or tragedy. Most of them simply resolved into something considerably more ordinary than either. Harriet, our new money hostess still circling the edges of the world she wanted so badly to enter, never quite got the invitation she spent those 3 years working toward, at least not in the form she originally imagined it. But her daughter, the 16-year-old watching her mother's campaign with that quiet, complicated attention, married, some years later, into a family considerably more established than Harriet's own, a match built less on Harriet's careful maneuvering than on the simple fact that by the time her daughter came of age, the whole rigid system had already begun, slowly, to loosen at its edges, new fortunes arriving faster than the old guard could effectively exclude them, the same process we saw with the Vanderbilts a generation earlier repeating itself, quieter and smaller, in dozens of less famous households across the city. Harriet herself, by her later years, had become something she likely never expected to become when she first hired that social secretary and started studying the correct order of calls. She had become, in her own modest way, one of the women other new arrivals to the city sought out for advice, a woman who understood, from painful personal experience, exactly how the machinery worked, and who was, by most accounts, considerably kinder to the families still climbing than the women who had once kept her waiting had ever been to her. And Nora, our lady's maid, worked for the same family for 11 years in total, watching Adelaide's daughter grow from the small child, glimpsed briefly each afternoon, into the young woman eventually presented and married in the season we just described, before leaving service herself in her late 30s to marry a widower with a small shop downtown. A shift in circumstances that moved her, in the strict terms this world used to measure such things, downward rather than upward, out of a grand house and into a considerably smaller and plainer one. Whether Nora considered this a loss is, again, not something we can know with any certainty, though I find myself hoping, and I think you might too, that a household of her own, however modest, however far from the marble and the imported silk, might have offered her something the 11 years of service, however skillfully performed, never quite could. I keep coming back, the more we sit with all of this tonight, to a single idea that runs underneath every single story we have told, from Adelaide's calling cards, to the dog dinner at Newport, to Nora's cold 5:30 mornings in the attic. This entire world was built, with extraordinary care and extraordinary expense, around the project of making certain kinds of labor completely invisible, so that wealth could appear to simply exist, effortlessly, the way weather exists, rather than being visibly produced by thousands of specific hours of specific work performed by specific people whose names, quite often, history simply did not bother to record. And it was built, at the very same time, around an almost obsessive visibility for a completely different kind of labor, the labor of appearing correct, appearing graceful, appearing exactly as wealthy and exactly as refined as your particular position required, a performance so constant and so exhausting that it is, I think, its own kind of genuine work, even though the entire social fiction of the era insisted that women like Adelaide and Florence did not work at all, that they simply lived, gracefully, as a kind of walking testament to their husband's success. There is something in that worth sitting with a little longer, I think. before we let the whole story finally rest for the night. The exhaustion of appearing effortless, the labor of looking like you have never worked a day in your life. It is a strange kind of cost, one this world never quite found a way to name honestly, and one that, if you squint at it just slightly, has never entirely disappeared from the world we live in now either, however different our own particular rules and rituals might look on the surface. Let me give you a few more of the smaller, stranger rules of this world before we start easing all the way towards sleep, because I think you will enjoy them, and because they round out the picture in a way the bigger stories, the balls and the scandals, sometimes miss. A respectable woman in this world did not smoke, not in public, and, in the more conservative households, not in private either. Cigarettes carrying an association with a specific and disreputable kind of woman that made the habit essentially unthinkable for anyone hoping to maintain her standing. When Alva Vanderbilt's daughter Consuelo, whom we met earlier in her unhappy marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, later took up smoking after she had moved to England and grown somewhat freer from her mother's direct control, it was considered, even among her new aristocratic circle, a small act of genuine rebellion, a woman quietly asserting a kind of independence through something as simple as a lit cigarette held in a gloved hand. Perfume, too, followed its own unwritten but firmly understood code. A truly fashionable woman wore scent so lightly applied that it registered only as the faintest suggestion, detectable perhaps if you stood quite close, never strong enough to announce itself across a room. A heavy, obvious perfume was read, in this world, almost the same way an overly elaborate gown might be read on the wrong occasion, as a kind of overreach, trying visibly, audibly, or in this case fragrantly, too hard. The correct scent, applied with the correct restraint, was meant to feel less like a deliberate choice and more like a simple, natural fact about the woman wearing it. One more small piece of the larger performance of effortlessness we have talked about so much tonight. Employment references worked their own strange system too, one that shaped Nora's entire working life just as thoroughly as it shaped the lives of every other servant in every other house we have visited tonight. A servant leaving a position, whether by her own choice or her employer's, needed a written character reference from that employer in order to be hired anywhere respectable afterward, and a poor reference, or worse, a flatly withheld one, could end a servant's career in service almost entirely, since word travelled quickly enough between households and between the employment agencies that matched servants to positions that a reputation once damaged rarely had many chances to recover. This gave employers a genuinely enormous, almost frightening degree of power over the people who worked for them, power that most exercised with reasonable fairness, and power that a smaller number exercised with real and lasting cruelty, holding a good reference over a servant's head as leverage in disputes that had nothing directly to do with the quality of the work being performed. I think it is worth pausing on that particular imbalance for a moment, because it is easy across an evening spent mostly admiring the strange, glittering surface of this world, to lose sight of just how much real power sat underneath all the etiquette, and just how unevenly that power was actually distributed. The folded card corner and the correct fork and the 15-minute call were, in the end, rules governing a competition among people who all already had enough to eat, enough coal for their fires, enough security that losing a single social battle meant, at most, a wounded pride rather than a genuine threat to their survival. Nora's world operated under an entirely different, considerably harder set of rules, and I think tonight's story would not be honest if we let the glamour of the drawing room entirely crowd out the much colder calculations happening, always, just below stairs. This whole particular world, the one we have spent tonight wandering through, did not last nearly as long as its marble houses and its inherited pews might have suggested it would. Its unravelling began slowly, and then, in the way these things so often go, quite suddenly, the federal income tax, ratified in 1913, changed the underlying math of maintaining a household on this scale in ways that took a few years to fully register, but that eventually made the old model, dozens of live-in servants, a fresh wardrobe every season, a summer cottage with 70 rooms, considerably harder to sustain even for families whose fortunes remained, by any ordinary measure, enormous. The First World War, breaking out the following year in Europe and drawing America in by 1917, pulled young men out of ballrooms and into uniforms, pulled young women into war work that gave a great many of them their first real taste of purpose and independence outside the marriage market, and quietly, permanently thinned the pool of household staff available for hire as opportunities opened elsewhere that simply paid better and demanded less of a person's whole identity than a lifetime spent being addressed by someone else's chosen name. By the 1920s, the specific texture of the world we have spent tonight inside, the calling cards, the 15-minute visits, Mrs. Astor's 400, had largely dissolved into something else entirely, a newer, faster, considerably less formal version of wealth and status that would have looked, to Adelaide or to Mrs. Astor herself, almost unrecognizably loose, almost shockingly casual. Some of the old families adapted, many did not, their fortunes diminished by decades of maintaining establishments built for a world that had simply moved on without them, their grand Newport cottages eventually sold, subdivided, in some cases nearly abandoned, their marble halls echoing, for a time, with almost nobody in them at all, before later generations found new uses for a few of the grandest survivors, as museums, as event spaces, as the very same kind of touristic curiosity that draws visitors down Bellevue Avenue to this day, standing on the sidewalk exactly where the coaching parade once processed, looking in through windows at a world that, for all its careful rules, could not in the end protect itself from the passage of ordinary time. I find that ending strangely comforting, actually, the more I sit with it, and I hope you might too, as we let this whole story finally settle for the night. All of it, the marble and the diamonds and the 12-course dinners and the 400 jealously guarded names, was, underneath everything, simply people, trying as hard as people always try, in whatever era they happen to find themselves in, to matter, to belong, to be seen as valuable by the particular world around them. The rules were strange. The cost, especially to the people like Nora who made the whole performance possible without ever getting to join it, was often genuinely unfair. But the wanting underneath it, the wanting to belong, to be received rather than turned away, to matter to somebody, that part of the story is not strange at all. That part, I think, is simply human, dressed up, on this particular occasion, in bustles and diamond dog collars and gold cigarette papers, but recognizable, underneath all of that, as something you and I would understand perfectly well if we found ourselves standing in that parlor on a Thursday afternoon, waiting, the way Adelaide waited, to see who might come through the door. Come with me and walk back through the whole night one more time now, slowly, the way you might walk back through a house before turning out the last of the lamps. It is past 2 in the morning now, back in that first autumn we started with, and the city outside Adelaide's window has gone quiet in the particular way New York went quiet in this era, before its later century of ceaseless light and ceaseless noise. Gas lamps still burn along Fifth Avenue, though only every second or third one by this hour, the rest allowed to gutter low to save fuel through the long dead stretch between midnight and dawn. A lamplighter will not come to relight them properly until well before sunrise, moving down the avenue with his long pole the way his counterpart moved along it the evening before, lighting rather than extinguishing, the whole street breathing in and out on a schedule set by a single man walking its length twice a day. Somewhere a few blocks over, a milk wagon has already begun its rounds, hours before most of the city's wealthy households will stir. Horses pulling a cart loaded with glass bottles down streets, still mostly empty except for a night watchman making his slow, unhurried circuit past the darkened shop fronts, checking locks, calling out the hour in the old-fashioned way some of the older watchmen still preferred, a low, half-sung announcement that another quarter hour has safely passed. In the working-class tenements further downtown and further east, an entirely different rhythm of night is already stirring. Women waking soon to begin the earliest shift of laundry work or piecework sewing before their own long days properly start. The same city holding, within a few miles of Adelaide's darkened parlor, an entire other world running on an entirely different clock, one this evening's story has only glimpsed at its edges, in Nora's cold attic mornings and Harriet's careful campaign, and the servants asleep 2 floors below the family they served. Up in Newport, if we travelled there in our minds just for a moment, the great cottages sit through the winter months almost entirely closed, shutters fastened, furniture draped in long white cloths against the dust, a skeleton staff of perhaps 2 or 3 caretakers, keeping the pipes from freezing and the roof from leaking through months when not a single member of the family who owns the place will set foot inside it at all. There is something almost eerie in picturing it, all that marble and gilt sitting silent and empty under a coating of January snow, waiting, the way a stage set waits between performances for the specific 8 or 9 weeks each summer when it will briefly, extravagantly come back to life. And somewhere, quietly, in a modest house downtown that we have not visited yet tonight, Nora, years from now, in the life she eventually builds after leaving service, will occasionally still wake at 5:30 out of nothing more than old habit, lying in the dark of a bedroom considerably smaller and plainer than the attic room she once shared, listening for a bell that will never ring again, and finding, more often than not, a small, surprising peace in its permanent silence. Let me tell you a few more of the smaller oddities of this world before we finally let the whole evening rest, because there are still corners of it we have not properly visited, and I think they are worth the last stretch of your attention tonight. Money itself, the actual subject of money, occupied a strange and specific place in polite conversation among this class of people, which is to say it occupied almost no place at all. Discussing the exact cost of anything directly, a gown, a house, a dinner, was considered genuinely vulgar, a mark of exactly the kind of new, uncertain money that had not yet learnt the deeper rule underneath all the other rules, which was that true, comfortable wealth never needed to announce its own size out loud. Prices were referenced obliquely, if at all, through comparison rather than number, a gown described as considerably finer than last season's rather than costing a specific sum, a house described as generous rather than valued at anything precise. This created its own small, constant tension, because everyone in the room was, in fact, thinking about money essentially all the time, calculating fortunes and dowries and the relative worth of a match with real precision behind closed doors, while the actual language of the drawing room pretended, with a straight face, that none of them were thinking about anything so common at all. Photography arrived into this world with its own quiet social ritual attached. The carte de visite, a small photographic portrait mounted on a card, roughly the size of a calling card, became enormously popular from the 1860s onward, and wealthy families exchanged them the way an earlier generation might have exchanged a miniature painted portrait, collected in albums, displayed on parlor tables, traded among friends and relatives as a way of keeping a physical, visual record of a social circle that might otherwise exist only in memory and correspondence. Sitting for a formal photograph was itself a small production, a visit to a professional studio, careful attention to dress and pose, the sitter required to hold perfectly still for several long seconds while the exposure completed, a stillness that produced the particular solemn, unsmiling expression we now associate with almost all photography from this era, less a reflection of the era's actual mood than a simple, practical consequence of how long a person had to sit motionless for the image to properly form. Spiritualism, too, found real purchase among this world's wealthiest women, a fashion for seances and mediums that ran, somewhat surprisingly, alongside all the careful rationality of the calling card system and the precise etiquette manuals. Grief, particularly the grief of a mother who had lost a child, a loss distressingly common in an era before modern medicine had tamed childhood illness the way it eventually would, drove more than one otherwise perfectly conventional society woman to seek out a medium promising contact with a lost loved one on the other side. Evenings spent in darkened parlors around a table, hands joined, waiting for a knock or a whispered message that might, however briefly, ease a sorrow that all the wealth in the world had proven powerless to prevent in the first place. It is a small, tender detail, I think, one that reminds you, again, that underneath every rule and every ritual we have spent tonight examining, these were simply people capable of exactly the same grief and exactly the same desperate hope as anyone in any other century. An unmarried woman, in this world, did not dine alone in a public restaurant under almost any circumstance, and the finer restaurants themselves often maintained a separate ladies' entrance and even a separate ladies' dining room, or ordinary, specifically so a woman arriving without a male escort, perhaps meeting a female friend for lunch, could be received and seated without ever having to pass through the main, more masculine dining room where unaccompanied women were considered, at best, faintly out of place, and at worst, a source of exactly the kind of unwelcome speculation that could damage a reputation built over years in a single careless afternoon. The bicycle, when it arrived in its modern safety design during the 1890s, caused a genuinely surprising amount of controversy inside this world, and I think the story is worth telling because it shows you, in miniature, exactly how anxious this society could become whenever a piece of new technology threatened to loosen even one small thread of its careful control over women's movement and women's dress. Cycling required, for practical reasons that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with simple mechanics, a looser, shorter skirt than the full-length gowns this world otherwise insisted upon, and some of the more daring cyclists adopted bloomers, a divided garment resembling loose trousers, in order to ride safely and comfortably at all. The reaction from more conservative corners of society was, by several contemporary accounts, remarkably fierce. Sermons preached against the supposedly indecent and unfeminine spectacle of a woman's legs, even fully covered by fabric, becoming visible in the act of peddling, newspaper editorials debating the moral implications of the new sport, with an intensity that seems, from this distance, almost impossible to square with something as innocent as a bicycle ride through a park. And yet the bicycle spread anyway, embraced by a new generation of young women who found in it a genuine, physical freedom that the 15-minute call and the chaperoned ballroom had never offered, the ability to travel independently, at speed, under their own power, without a carriage, without a driver, without, in many cases, any chaperone at all riding alongside to supervise. Susan B. Anthony, watching this shift unfold, reportedly remarked that the bicycle had done more for the emancipation of women than almost anything else in her lifetime, and whether or not that particular claim holds up under close historical scrutiny, it captures something real about how much this one specific, seemingly small technological change actually unsettled the careful architecture of control we have spent this entire evening examining. Newport, ever eager to absorb a new fashionable pastime into its own particular orbit, built a grand casino along Bellevue Avenue in the 1880s, not a casino in the modern gambling sense but a social and athletic club, and it was here, on its lawn courts, that the very first United States National Lawn Tennis Championship was played in 1881, a tournament that would eventually grow into the modern US Open, though in these early years it remained a considerably smaller, more intimate affair, watched by precisely the same social circle that filled the ballrooms each winter, now dressed for an afternoon of white flannel and careful, decorous athletic exertion rather than an evening of dancing. Servants, meanwhile, lived under their own strict and specific rules regarding romance and courtship, rules considerably harsher than anything governing Florence's carefully chaperoned ballroom flirtations. Many households forbade what was called followers entirely, meaning a maid or footman was simply not permitted to receive visits from a romantic partner at the house, on the theory that such visits distracted from work and introduced an unwelcome element of disorder into an otherwise carefully controlled domestic machine. A servant's single half-day off each week, and perhaps one additional evening, represented essentially her only opportunity for any kind of independent social or romantic life at all, snatched hours spent walking in a public park or attending a dance hall in a part of the city her employers would likely never set foot in themselves. A small, precious pocket of genuine freedom carved out of a schedule otherwise entirely consumed by someone else's household. There is one more mourning custom I want to mention, because I think it belongs alongside the hair jewelry we discussed earlier. Strange to modern eyes, but genuinely tender in its own context. When a family member died, particularly a child, it was not uncommon in this era, among families both wealthy and modest, to commission a photograph of the deceased, carefully posed, sometimes dressed in their best clothing, sometimes arranged among living family members, in a portrait meant to be the family's final complete image together. This practice, which strikes most people today as somewhere between unsettling and outright macabre, made a particular kind of sense in a world where photography itself was still expensive and occasional enough that many families, especially those who had lost an infant or a very young child, might otherwise possess no image of that child at all. the sitting for a formal portrait during life having never quite happened before illness intervened. The resulting photographs, some of which survive in museum and private collections today, were treated by the families who commissioned them not as something morbid, but as a final, precious act of remembrance, a way of ensuring that a beloved face was not simply lost entirely to memory alone. At the opera, meanwhile, a specific and very deliberate etiquette governed exactly when a fashionable woman was meant to arrive. Arriving precisely at the advertised start time was, somewhat counterintuitively, considered a small mark of inexperience, since it suggested an eagerness that a truly confident society woman was not meant to display. The fashionable hour to arrive was some 20 or 30 minutes into the performance, guaranteeing a small, visible stir as the newcomer settled into her box, and much of the actual social activity of an opera evening happened not during the performance itself, which polite society often treated as background rather than genuine focus of attention, but during the intermissions, when box doors opened and gentlemen circulated from box to box, paying brief calls exactly analogous to the daytime calling system we discussed at the very start of tonight's story, checking in with acquaintances, extending or declining small invitations, conducting in the space of a 15-minute intermission an entire miniature version of the same social choreography that governed a Thursday afternoon parlour. I find that detail, the idea of an entire opera house functioning as one more stage for the exact same rituals we watched play out in Adelaide's front parlour at the very beginning of tonight, strangely satisfying actually. The way finding an echo of an idea you thought had been left behind can feel satisfying. The whole world we have spent this evening in, it turns out, kept building the same basic structure over and over, in different rooms, at different hours, with different props, the folded card and the intermission visit, and the dance card, and the seating chart, all of them variations on one single, endlessly repeated question: who matters, who is seen, who is let in, and who, however politely, however gently, is simply, quietly, kept waiting at the door. There was one category of public activity, though, that this world did consider entirely appropriate for a wealthy married woman, and I think it deserves real attention because it complicates the picture we have been building all evening of women confined purely to parlours and ballrooms. Charitable work, conducted through hospital boards, orphan asylums, and a growing number of organised relief societies, gave women like Adelaide a rare, sanctioned outlet for exactly the kind of organisational skill and public authority that the rest of this world worked so hard to keep hidden behind a fiction of effortless grace. A woman serving on a hospital's board of lady managers might oversee real budgets, make real decisions about staffing and supplies, negotiate with physicians and administrators, essentially running significant pieces of an institution's actual operation, and doing so with a public visibility that her calling card campaigns and dinner party seating charts never quite permitted. This work mattered enormously to the institutions themselves. Many of New York's earliest hospitals, orphanages, and settlement houses depended almost entirely on the fundraising galas, the charity balls, and the direct financial contributions these wealthy women organized and often personally supplied, a genuine tangible good produced directly out of the same social machinery of balls and calling cards and careful precedents that governed everything else in this world. Caroline Astor herself, for all her ferocious gatekeeping of the ballroom, sat on the boards of several charitable institutions, and quite a few of the women we have spent tonight with, women whose entire visible lives seemed built around the pursuit of pure social status, found in this particular corner of their world something that reads, from the historical record, as genuine purpose, real satisfaction, a use of their considerable capability that the rest of their circumscribed lives rarely permitted them to feel. Let me tell you briefly about gloves, before we move toward the final part of tonight's story, because there is one more layer to the glove rules we touched on earlier with Mrs. Pruitt's careful gloved handshake. A gentleman greeting a lady on the street removed his hat briefly in acknowledgement, but a lady's own gloved hand was, by the strictest etiquette of the period, never actually kissed skin to skin in a casual social greeting. The gesture performed instead as a kind of formal bow over the gloved hand itself, lips never quite making contact, a small, careful physical distance maintained even in a gesture that looks, to modern eyes watching it in an old film, like genuine intimacy. Removing a glove in public, for any reason beyond the most practical necessity, carried its own small charge of meaning, and a young woman who let a glove slip off during a garden party conversation with a particular young man, whether by accident or, occasionally, by careful and deliberate design, was engaging in a small, coded flirtation that everyone around her would have read instantly, correctly, and with considerable interest. Carriages, too, had their own precise order of operations. A lady entered a carriage first, always, gathering her skirts carefully to avoid catching them in the door, while a gentleman waited, offering a hand for balance if the step was high or the ground uneven, and exited last, after every lady in the party had already been safely handed down. Seating within the carriage itself followed rank exactly the way seating at a dinner table did, the most honoured position facing forward in the direction of travel, reserved for the eldest or most senior woman present, while junior members of the party, daughters, younger relatives, sometimes found themselves riding backward for an entire long afternoon of calls, a small physically uncomfortable reminder, repeated trip after trip, of exactly where they stood in their own family's careful hierarchy. It is time to slow all the way down now, because we have gathered enough for one night, enough dinners on horseback, and folded card corners, and dollar princesses, and cold 5:30 mornings in a servant's attic, and what remains is simply to let it all settle, the way sediment settles in a glass of water left standing still on a nightstand. Think, for a moment, about the sheer number of hours we have walked through tonight. Adelaide's 90 minutes at the dressing table, repeated most mornings of her adult life. Nora's day that began before dawn and rarely ended before midnight. Florence's dozen dances, repeated across dozens of winter evenings, season after season, in pursuit of an outcome she could not fully control, no matter how gracefully she performed her part in it. Harriet's 3 long years of careful campaigning toward a door that never quite opened the way she hoped. All of it adds up, across an entire lifetime, to something almost incomprehensibly large. Thousands and thousands of hours spent maintaining a performance so total, so completely woven into the fabric of daily life, that the people living inside it rarely had the distance to see it as a performance at all. It simply was life. It was simply what a day was made of, and there is a particular kind of peace, I think, in finally setting all of that down. The way you are setting down your own day right now, wherever you are tonight, whatever hours and calculations and small performances filled the hours between when you woke this morning and when you finally pressed play on this video. You do not have 90 minutes of hairdressing ahead of you tomorrow morning. You do not have a folded card corner to consider, or a chaperone watching from the wall, or a morning brooch woven from a lock of someone else's hair waiting in a drawer. Your world asks different things of you, and I am sure, on plenty of days, it asks quite enough. But tonight at least none of it needs your attention. Not the ballroom, not the parlour, not the calling tray sitting empty or full. Just this. Just the weight of the blanket, and the quiet of wherever you are, and the last of these words settling over you the way that Newport snow settled, quietly, over all that shuttered marble, waiting for a summer that was still months away. I think about Adelaide sometimes, if I am honest with you, long after finishing the research for an evening like this one. Not really Adelaide herself, who never quite existed exactly as I have described her, a composite drawn from dozens of real diaries and real letters and real etiquette manuals stitched together into one plausible woman for the sake of tonight's story, but the shape of her, the specific texture of a life spent almost entirely in service to an audience that was in the end mostly imagined, mostly a fiction the whole world silently agreed to maintain together. I think about how much of what she built, the calling list, the daughter's careful match, the reputation guarded so closely across so many careful Thursdays, simply dissolved, within a generation or two, into nothing anyone alive today remembers at all, unless, like you, they happen to be lying in the dark on a random evening listening to a stranger's voice describe it back to them. There is something almost gentle in that dissolving, I have come to think, rather than something sad. All that careful, exhausting maintenance, all that fear of the wrong fold or the wrong fork or the wrong pew, eventually just let go, the way your own body is letting go right now, muscle by muscle, the way a held breath finally, naturally releases. The marble houses stand mostly empty now, or filled with strangers paying admission to walk through rooms that once required a folded card just to enter, the 400 names on Mrs. Astor's old list mean almost nothing to almost anyone anymore. And somehow, the world went on perfectly well without any of it, the way your own world will go on perfectly well tomorrow, regardless of whatever small private performances filled today. Before I let you go all the way under tonight, let me leave you with a few last small strange fragments from this world. Quick ones, nothing that needs much unpacking, just little true things to drift off on, the way you might drift off flipping slowly through an old photograph album, pausing a moment on each page before your eyes finally close for good. A fashionable woman's fan was not simply for cooling herself on a warm ballroom evening. It was, in its own quiet way, a genuine instrument of communication, an entire silent language reportedly built up around exactly how a fan was held, opened, or moved. A fan drawn slowly across the cheek said to mean one thing, a fan held closed against the lips said to mean something else entirely, though historians now believe a good portion of this so-called language of the fan was invented later by manufacturers eager to sell more fans, rather than genuinely practiced with any real consistency in Gilded Age ballrooms themselves. Still, the fan itself, however it was actually used, remained one of the era's essential small props, folded from silk or ostrich feather, sometimes hand-painted by a genuinely skilled artist, carried into nearly every formal evening a fashionable woman attended. Then there was the vinaigrette, a small ornamental case, often gold or silver, holding a sponge soaked in aromatic vinegar or smelling salts, hung from many a fashionable woman's chatelaine, or sat tucked into her reticule specifically to be produced at the first sign of one of those tight-laced fainting spells we discussed earlier. A genuine piece of jewelry whose entire function was medical rather than decorative, though, of course, in this world, even the medical necessities came finely wrought and beautifully engraved. A gentleman's calling card, unlike a lady's, sometimes carried a small folded corner meant to indicate he was calling on behalf of the entire family rather than himself alone, a single piece of pasteboard doing the social work of an entire household's visit. False teeth, for those wealthy enough to afford the finest available dental work, were carved by this point from porcelain or vulcanized rubber rather than the ivory or animal teeth of earlier decades, a genuine, meaningful improvement in comfort and appearance that a truly wealthy patient could access years, sometimes decades, before the same technology became available to anyone outside their particular circle. No hostess, under any circumstance, discussed a servant's error in front of guests, no matter how visible or how disruptive that error might be, correcting it instead with a single quiet word exchanged later, in private. The public face of the evening required to remain flawless regardless of whatever small crisis had briefly threatened it from below stairs, and a truly well-trained footman, serving at a formal dinner, could carry a fully loaded silver tray down an entire flight of narrow back stairs, in the dark, without a single sound, a skill built through years of repetition, valued so highly that a footman who mastered it perfectly could command meaningfully better wages than one who had not. That is the world, or at least as much of it as we can hold in a single evening together. The calling cards and the cut direct, the arsenic wafers and the dog dinner, the 90-minute mornings and the 15-minute visits, the marble cottages standing empty through a Newport winter, and underneath every single bit of it, the same simple human wanting that has never really gone anywhere at all, the wanting to belong, to be seen, to matter to the people around you. Before we settle all the way into that final quiet, though, there is one more household I want to walk you through, because we have spent this whole evening in the front rooms and the ballrooms and the parlours, and I think it is worth spending a few final minutes somewhere we have only glimpsed in passing, the actual bedroom of a woman like Adelaide, at the end of an ordinary evening rather than a grand one, because I think the smallest, least performed hours of her day tell you something the balls and the dinners never quite could. After a quiet evening at home, no dinner party, no ball, just the ordinary business of family life, Adelaide's undressing followed its own unhurried ritual, considerably gentler than the 90-minute construction of her morning toilette. Ellis unlaced the corset slowly, working down the row of hooks and eyes at the back, and there is a specific physical relief in that moment that more than one diary from the period describes with genuine feeling. the sudden full expansion of breath after a whole day spent contained. Ribs and lungs finally allowed their complete natural range for the first time since morning. The heavy day dress came off, hung carefully, brushed if needed, and a soft dressing gown replaced it, considerably lighter, considerably kinder to the body than anything worn during the visible hours of the day. Hair came down next, pins removed one by one and set into a small dish. The elaborate daytime arrangement unwound and brushed out again with that same boar bristle brush, 100 slow strokes by the count many etiquette and beauty manuals of the period actually recommended, though whether any real woman counted quite that precisely every single night is impossible to know for certain. What we do know, from surviving letters and diaries, is that this nightly brushing became for many women one of the few genuinely restful rituals of an otherwise relentlessly scheduled day, a repetitive, physical, faintly meditative task performed in low lamplight, often in near total silence, sometimes the only real silence a woman like Adelaide experienced in her entire day. Jewellery came off and returned to its case, each piece checked and accounted for exactly the way Nora checked it each morning. The face received a final, simpler version of the cold cream routine. No rice powder needed now, no audience left to please. And then, finally, bed. Sheets that a housemaid had warmed earlier in the evening, with a long-handled brass warming pan filled with hot coals, drawn briskly across the linens and removed well before anyone actually climbed in, leaving behind nothing but a lingering, gentle warmth against the New York autumn chill outside the window. There is a particular quality to this hour, the hour just before sleep, that I think transcends almost everything else we have discussed tonight. Every rule and every rank and every carefully calculated calling list. In this hour, briefly, Adelaide was not performing anything for anyone. She was simply a woman, tired in the ordinary way anyone is tired at the end of a long day, lying in the dark, her mind perhaps drifting toward tomorrow's obligations, perhaps not, perhaps simply drifting the way a mind drifts in the last few minutes before it finally lets go entirely. Let me give you one final scene before we truly let go. A winter one this time, since we have spent most of tonight in autumn and summer, and I think a house in the depths of a New York January deserves its own brief moment tonight. By the coldest weeks of the year, the fashionable social calendar had already shifted into its own particular winter rhythm, the calling and the balls and the opera all continuing, if anything more intensely than in the milder months, because winter in this world was, somewhat counterintuitively, the busiest and most socially demanding stretch of the entire year, precisely because Newport and its long summer idleness were still months away, and the entire concentrated energy of the season poured itself instead into a dense, glittering run of dinners and dances packed between Thanksgiving and the beginning of Lent. Snow changed the practical texture of daily life considerably. Carriage wheels were exchanged for sleigh runners on the days heavy snow made the streets impassable to ordinary wheeled transport, and a sleigh ride itself became for a season its own small fashionable outing, wealthy families racing lightweight cutters up and down a cleared stretch of road, specifically set aside for exactly this purpose, bells fixed to the harness partly for safety, since a horse-drawn sleigh moved nearly silently over packed snow otherwise, and partly, of course, because the sound itself had become a pleasant, expected part of the whole winter spectacle. Inside the houses, coal fires burned constantly through these months, in every room in regular use, tended by housemaids whose entire January and February were organized around little else beyond hauling coal, laying fires and clearing ash, a specific, exhausting seasonal intensification of the labor we discussed earlier with Nora and her early mornings. Windows were sealed more tightly against drafts, heavy curtains drawn earlier each evening as the days shortened, and the whole rhythm of a household's public entertaining compressed itself into fewer, earlier hours, dinners beginning perhaps a little sooner, guests departing a little earlier than the long late summer evenings in Newport would ever have permitted, everyone racing, in their own way, against an early winter darkness that fell, some afternoons, before 4 o'clock had even properly arrived. And yet, for all that practical difficulty, winter carried its own specific beauty in this world too, one that several diaries from the period describe with real, unguarded affection rather than the usual careful social calculation. Snow settling silently over Fifth Avenue in the deep hours of the night, muffling the ordinary clatter of hooves and wheels into something closer to true quiet. Gas lamps and, increasingly through the 90s, the newer electric lights, throwing warm gold rectangles onto fresh white snow from 100 tall windows up and down the avenue. A particular hush that fell over the whole city on the heaviest snow nights, a hush that even this relentlessly performed, relentlessly scheduled world could not entirely resist, drawing even its busiest, most careful hostesses to simply stand for a moment at a cold window, watching the snow fall, before turning back to whatever obligation waited for them in the room behind them. There is one more household anxiety I have not yet told you about tonight, and it followed this world through every single season, regardless of how carefully any family managed its calling list or its dinner menus. Childhood illness moved through Gilded Age New York with a speed and a randomness that no amount of money could fully control. Scarlet fever and diphtheria and measles sweeping through entire neighborhoods some winters, striking wealthy nurseries with exactly the same indifference they showed the crowded tenements downtown, because the germ theory of disease, while increasingly understood by the more progressive physicians of the era, had not yet translated into the kind of reliable prevention or treatment that could actually stop an outbreak once it began. A wealthy family facing a sick child called immediately for the very best physician money could secure, and could afford round-the-clock nursing care that a poorer family simply could not. Private duty nurses hired to sit through the night watching a fever, changing linens, administering whatever treatments the physician recommended. This genuinely improved a wealthy child's odds in ways that mattered: better nutrition beforehand, faster and more attentive medical response, cleaner water and better ventilated rooms than the crowded tenement housing many working families endured. But it did not make a wealthy child immune, and the historical record of this era, in family letters and in the mourning jewelry we discussed earlier, in the small dark-clothed figures visible in more than one family portrait from these decades, tells you plainly enough how often even the wealthiest households buried a child before that child reached adulthood. A grief this world's elaborate mourning rituals existed, in part, specifically to help a family survive and publicly carry. I think this detail matters at the very end of tonight's story, because it is easy, across an evening spent admiring diamond dog collars and gold cigarette papers, to start picturing this world as somehow protected from the ordinary hardships of being alive. It was not. Wealth bought comfort, bought beauty, bought an extraordinary glittering surface to nearly every hour of the day. It did not buy safety from grief, or from illness, or from the simple universal fact that a life, however carefully managed, however perfectly performed, remains fragile in exactly the same ways for everyone living it, in a 70-room cottage or a single small room shared by two tired ladies' maids. Let me tell you about one small, quiet comfort this world did reliably offer, though, before we finally close the door on it completely tonight. A wealthy household's nursery, whatever its other complications, its distant parents and its paid caregivers, was reliably warm through even the coldest New York winter, coal delivered without fail, fires tended around the clock by a staff whose entire purpose was making sure no child in that house ever woke cold in the night. A luxury, yes, and an unevenly distributed one, but a real comfort nonetheless, the kind of small physical mercy that, whatever else we think about this glittering, unequal, endlessly performed world, is worth acknowledging honestly before we let the whole story finally rest. And rest is, in the end, exactly where every single person in tonight's story eventually arrived. Every calling card finally left unanswered, every ballroom finally emptied, every careful hierarchy of pew and place setting and folded corner finally, quietly, dissolved into the same simple, ordinary dark that comes for every house at the end of every single day, rich or poor, old money or new, remembered by history or entirely, gently forgotten. One last thread before we let it all go tonight, and it takes us back fittingly to where we began. That front parlour, that folded card, that quiet coded language spoken almost entirely through small physical objects and their careful handling. I want to tell you what eventually happened to the calling card itself, because even this smallest, most specific ritual of the entire era had its own particular ending, and I think it closes tonight's story rather well. By the very early 1900s, as the telephone finally overcame the etiquette world's initial suspicion of it, and as the pace of city life generally began to quicken in ways that made a leisurely 15-minute afternoon call feel increasingly difficult to fit into an ordinary week, the whole elaborate architecture of calling days and folded corners began, slowly, to loosen. Telephone calls started replacing a meaningful portion of the in-person visits that had once structured every fashionable woman's Thursday afternoon. Younger women, coming of age in the new century rather than the old one, found the whole system increasingly quaint, even faintly absurd, a relic their mothers still practiced with real seriousness, but that they themselves engaged with more loosely, more casually, treating the once rigid rules as suggestions rather than genuine social law. The cards themselves did not vanish entirely, not immediately. They lingered, in smaller and more casual forms, through the 1910s and 20s, used still for formal occasions, weddings and funerals, and the most official introductions, but the daily, obsessive precision of the earlier decades, the specific fold for this occasion and that one, the 15-minute window, the strict hierarchy of who called on whom first, faded gradually into something closer to a memory than a living practice, until eventually, within a single generation, an entire elaborate social technology that had once determined a woman's whole standing in the world simply stopped mattering to almost anyone at all. I find something quietly moving in that particular ending. More moving, honestly, than almost any of the grander stories we told tonight. The costume balls and the dollar princesses and the 70-room cottages. A whole intricate system, built with such tremendous care, defended so fiercely by women like Mrs. Astor for decades, requiring so much daily labor and daily calculation from women like Adelaide and Florence and Harriet, simply, eventually stopped. Not through any single dramatic collapse, no scandal large enough to bring it down all at once, the way the Bradley Martin ball nearly did for one unlucky family. It simply grew quieter and quieter across a couple of decades, until one day nobody in particular noticed, the way you might not notice the exact evening a habit finally fully breaks. And that, I think, is where I want to leave this whole glittering, exhausting, genuinely strange world tonight. Not at its loudest moment, not at the dog dinner or the horseback supper or the costume ball that scandalized an entire nation, but at this quieter, gentler vanishing, a whole society easing itself slowly out of its own rigid rules, the same unhurried way you are easing yourself, right now, out of today, and into whatever rest is waiting for you tonight. No single grand ending, no single dramatic close, just a slow, gradual softening, one folded corner at a time, until finally, quietly, there was nothing left to fold at all, only the ordinary, welcome dark, arriving the way it always does, for absolutely everyone. Let me give you just a little more before that final quiet takes over completely, because I realize we have spent so much time on the women of this world tonight, that I have left out one particular figure who moved through nearly every scene we visited without ever quite stepping into the light, and I think she deserves a proper moment before we close the door for good. The housekeeper in a grand establishment held a position genuinely distinct from every other servant in the building, closer in authority to a business manager than to the maids and footmen she supervised, entrusted with the household's actual keys, sometimes dozens of them, for the linen closets, the wine cellar, the silver safe, carried on a heavy ring at her waist that made an unmistakable, particular sound as she moved through the house, a sound the younger servants learned to recognize from 2 rooms away. A woman who might we call Mrs. Halloran occupied exactly this role in a house like Adelaide's, in her late 40s, unmarried, as housekeepers very often were, since the position required a live-in commitment that marriage and children would have made nearly impossible to sustain. She managed a household budget that ran, across a full year, to a genuinely substantial sum, negotiated with tradesmen, kept detailed account books that the master of the house reviewed only occasionally, trusting her judgment on the countless small daily decisions, which butcher, which grocer, how much coal to order for the coming month, that kept the entire operation running smoothly without ever once requiring the family upstairs to think about any of it directly. Mrs. Halloran's own room sat apart from the other servants' quarters, slightly larger, slightly better furnished, a small private mark of her particular standing within the household's shadow hierarchy, and her authority over the younger maids was, by most accounts from the period, considerable, closer in some ways to a mother's authority than an employer's, since she was very often the person who trained a young housemaid fresh from the countryside in the specific, exacting standards a Fifth Avenue household required, standards no rural upbringing could possibly have prepared her for on its own. Mrs. Halloran decided who ate where at the servants' table below stairs, arbitrated small disputes between staff before they could grow into anything serious enough to reach the family's attention, and carried, in her own quiet way, nearly as much genuine responsibility for the household's daily functioning as Adelaide herself carried for its social standing, though of course only one of these two women's labour was ever recognised, publicly, as work at all. It strikes me, turning this last figure over in my mind before we finally let the whole story rest, that we have spent this entire evening moving through a world built almost entirely out of women's careful, unacknowledged labour, at every single level of its hierarchy, from Mrs. Astor at the very top deciding who belonged among her 400, down through Adelaide managing her calling list and her daughter's prospects, down through Mrs. Halloran managing an entire household's daily operation, down through Nora managing her mistress's wardrobe and her own impossible hours, down, finally, to the youngest scullery maid in the coldest corner of the kitchen, managing nothing more than the next pot in an endless line of pots, and still, somehow, managing it. Different scales, different rooms, entirely different degrees of comfort and choice and genuine freedom, but the same fundamental shape underneath all of it, women holding an enormous amount of the actual, practical weight of this glittering world, almost none of them ever quite credited, publicly, with holding anything at all. That is, I think, the truest thing this whole strange, glittering evening has had to tell you, more true than any single dog dinner or diamond-studded cufflink, more true even than the folded card corner we began with all those hours ago. Let it be the last thought you carry with you into sleep tonight, if any thought needs to follow you there at all. Somewhere behind every performance of effortlessness this world so carefully maintained, there was always, quietly, someone working. One very last small thing, and then I truly will let you go. I mentioned earlier that certain fortunes in this world still carried, in the language of the drawing room, the faint unwelcome smell of the factory or the mine they came from, and I want to tell you, briefly, what eventually happened to that particular distinction, because I think it closes tonight's story with exactly the right kind of gentle irony. The old families who once looked down so completely on new money, the railroad fortunes and the meatpacking fortunes and the mining fortunes, did not in the end manage to hold their position forever either. Within 2 or 3 generations, many of those same old family fortunes had thinned considerably, spent down across decades of maintaining houses and habits built for a world that had already begun quietly disappearing by the 1920s, while a fresh wave of even newer money, automobiles this time, and eventually radio, and eventually things nobody at Mrs. Astor's ballroom could possibly have imagined, simply repeated the entire cycle again, new fortunes slowly buying their way into whatever remained of polite society, exactly the way the Vanderbilts once did, exactly the way Harriet spent 3 long years trying and failing to do. There is no true permanent aristocracy in this story, it turns out, whatever it might have looked like from inside any single decade of it, only a very long, very slow relay, one fortune's careful gatekeeping, eventually giving way to the next fortune's turn at the gate, generation after generation, each one certain, for its own brief moment at the top, that its particular rules were the real ones, the permanent ones, the ones that mattered. None of them were. They were simply the rules of a moment, dressed up, as every era's rules always are, in language that made them sound like they had always existed and always would. And with that thought, gentle and a little humbling all at once, I think we can finally let the whole evening rest completely. Let me leave you, finally, with the smallest scene of the entire evening, smaller even than the folded card we opened with. It is very late now, later than any hour we have visited yet tonight, and in a plain, unremarkable room somewhere on the top floor of a Fifth Avenue mansion, Nora is finally, completely asleep, the bell that will wake her still hours away, her breathing slow and even in the dark, entirely unbothered, for these few private hours, by hierarchy or hairstyle or the correct fold of anyone's calling card. Downstairs, several floors below her, Adelaide sleeps too, in linens a housemaid warmed hours earlier, her jewellery accounted for and returned to its case, her tomorrow already sketched out in a small leather notebook waiting patiently on the desk. Two women, two entirely different lives, sharing, for these last quiet hours before dawn, the exact same simple, ordinary, undemanding rest. That is where tonight's story finally ends. Not in a ballroom, not at a dinner table set with 20 pieces of silver, but here, in the dark, in the 1 hour of the entire Gilded Age day that asked absolutely nothing of anybody at all. Let it be where your own night ends too. Whatever performance filled your own day today, whatever small calculations and careful managements it required of you, none of it is needed anymore tonight. Just this quiet, just this rest, just the simple, ordinary dark, arriving gently, the way it always does, for you, exactly as it once did for all of them. And if, tonight, none of this world's small comforts happen to be yours, no warmed linens, no attentive housemaid, no leather notebook waiting patiently downstairs, know that the rest waiting for you is exactly as real, exactly as complete, exactly as deserved as anything Adelaide or Nora or Mrs. Halloran ever found at the end of one of their long, glittering, exhausting days. Sleep does not ask for a folded card. It never has. There is a particular kindness in that thought, I think, the last one I want to leave with you tonight, before the words finally stop and the quiet simply carries on without them. Every single elaborate rule we walked through this evening, every folded corner and correct fork and carefully calculated calling list, existed only for the waking hours, only for the world of eyes and audiences and careful performance. The moment the lamp went out, all of it, every single distinction this glittering world worked so hard to maintain, simply stopped mattering, for Adelaide exactly as much as for Nora, for Mrs. Astor exactly as much as for the newest, least accepted family still circling hopefully at the edges of her ballroom. Rest arrived the same way for every single one of them, unearned, unbought, unperformed, the one truly democratic hour this entire rigid, unequal world ever actually offered anybody. Let it arrive for you now that same simple way. No performance required, no audience watching, just you and the quiet and whatever soft, ordinary dark is waiting, right now, to finally close over the last of tonight's words. Let your shoulders drop now if they haven't already. Let your jaw soften. Wherever you are, whatever the hour actually is where you are lying right now, let it be, for these last few minutes, something closer to that 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon we started with, quiet, suspended, nothing required of you at all except your own presence in the room. I keep returning, in these final minutes, to the image of the house late at night, the one we visited a little while ago, coal turned to ash in the grate, the last lamp turned low, everyone finally, properly asleep. There is something in that image I find genuinely restful, more restful, honestly, than almost anything else we discussed tonight, because for all the performance and the exhaustion and the careful management that filled every one of Adelaide's waking hours, sleep itself asked nothing of her at all. No fork was wrong in sleep, no card was folded incorrectly, no caller waited, disappointed, in an empty parlour. Sleep was, in this world just as much as in yours, the one entirely honest hour of the day, the 1 hour that required no folded corner, no correct 15 minutes, no performance whatsoever. Picture, if it helps you, the whole city finally settling, the last carriage returning some tired guest home from a dinner that ran later than planned, the last lamp in the last window along Fifth Avenue finally going dark, somewhere a night watchman calling out an hour to an empty street, somewhere else a lady's maid, finally released from duty, climbing the last narrow flight of stairs to her own small room, setting down whatever she has been carrying, and simply, quietly, letting the day end. Somewhere, a child in a nursery 2 floors above a ballroom, already long asleep, entirely unaware of the 10,000 small rules that will, in a decade or two, come to govern almost every hour of their own adult life. Still, for now, simply a child, breathing slowly in a dark room, safe and warm and utterly unbothered by any of it. That is where I want to leave you tonight, in that particular hush, the one that falls over every house eventually, wealthy or otherwise, grand or modest, marble or plaster, the hush that does not care about calling cards or dance cards or the correct fork for the fish course, the hush that simply arrives every single night for every single person, regardless of anything else that happened during the hours before it. Let it arrive for you now too. Let the folded corners and the 15-minute calls and the 12-course dinners drift slowly out of focus, the way a room drifts out of focus in the last moments before real sleep finally takes hold. You do not need to remember any of it in the morning. You do not need to hold on to Adelaide or Florence or Harriet or Nora or any of the small, careful performances that filled their long, strange, glittering days. You only need to let your own breathing slow, let your own body settle fully into wherever you are lying right now, and let the rest of tonight simply happen the way it always does, quietly, without any effort from you at all. I am glad you spent this evening here with me. I hope, wherever you are, in whatever city or country or quiet corner of the world you are listening from tonight, that sleep comes easily now and stays with you gently until morning. Thank you for letting Sleepy Old World be part of your night, tonight and every night you choose to return. Sleep well, truly and completely well, friend, and I will see you again soon, right here, whenever you are ready to return. We have been somewhere strange and glittering and human tonight, and now, at last, it is simply time to rest, easily, gently, completely, for as long as you need, until morning finds you exactly where you are.